So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. I'm back at Young Earth Creationism after an almost 5-week break. Today we're looking at a conversation that was had on a Creation Ministries International set. In case you're not familiar with them, CMI is the Australian-based organization that used to be called Answers in Genesis until they broke up with Ken Ham, and he got to keep the name in the divorce. The host is James Philpott, whom I've never heard of, and the guest is Dr. Don Batten. He has a PhD in plant physiology from the University of Sydney, according to his bio. The title of this talk is 5 More Failed Predictions of Evolution. The 5 are: 1. There should be no carbon-14 in diamonds. 2. There should be no carbon-14 in coal. 3. Relates to the folding of rocks. 4. Relates to bioturbation. And 5. Convergence. Of course, all but one of those is not evolution. Numbers 1 and 2 aren't predictions of anything that I'm aware of, since there absolutely should be trace amounts of carbon-14 in both diamonds and coal. Numbers 3 and 4 aren't predictions, they're chapter titles from the mid-19th century. And number 5 is just a thing that happens. Well, I suppose that's enough chatter from me. Let's get past the copyright minefield that is the intro to this video, and pick up with the beginning of the interview/conversation/whatever.
Today we're going to look at 5 predictions and see how they have fared.
No, we're not. We're going to look at some straw men, and one thing that is just a thing that happens. But okay.
Have they been proven true, or have they been falsified?
Proof?
We don't do that here.
Today, I have Don with me in the studio. Don has been working in his area of research for over 20 years, which is plant biology.
His area of research being how different parts of a plant work together to keep the whole organism going. Something we are not going to be talking about in this series.
So, Dr. Don Batten, you're going to be telling us 5 failed predictions of evolution today. What do you actually mean by failed prediction?
I'm always happy to see when people define their terms before they begin a discussion. Normally, creationists hate to do this, so it's refreshing to see it happening.
Well, science advances by failed predictions. People think about proving things, but in fact, we disprove things rather than prove things.
That's true.
That's why in scientific papers, you generally don't say you have accepted the hypothesis, but rather that you have rejected the null hypothesis.
So when you make a prediction, for example, a very simplistic prediction would be all horses are brown. So you can examine millions of horses that are brown, and it doesn't prove that all horses are brown. All it takes is seeing one white horse, and you've got a failed prediction.
This man is an Australian. Why wouldn't he use the black swan? The famous version of this is the hypothesis that all swans are white. This was believed to be true by Europeans for centuries, probably millennia. But when Europeans started colonizing Australia, they found black swans, and that fact of life was immediately overturned. You'd think he could reference his own country's history, but whatever.
So observing lots of brown horses is a technical fallacy called affirming the consequent, which sounds complex.
No, observing brown horses isn't confirming the consequent, it's just an observation. Confirming the consequent is a logical fallacy, so only an argument can confirm the consequent. The fallacy takes the form of if P then Q, Q therefore P. A real-world example would be if Charlie ate all the potato chips, the bag of chips will be empty. The bag of chips is empty, therefore Charlie ate all the potato chips. Of course, this does not follow. Perhaps Charlie only ate some of them and shared the rest with a guest. Perhaps the guest ate all of them. Perhaps they were stale and Charlie dumped the bag into the trash in disgust, but for some reason neglected to discard the bag as well. Now, observing brown horses and then arguing that this means that all horses are brown is indeed confirming the consequent, but the observation alone is not.
But it's actually a fallacy to say you've proven something. So you disprove things rather than prove things.
Yes, that is generally how science works. It's not that we've proven that fire is a rapid exothermic oxidation, it's that we've disproven all the alternative hypotheses, and so far no one has turned up one that is both plausible and can actually make better predictions than the oxygen theory of fire, which would disprove that theory if it happened. Similarly, we haven't proven evolution, we've disproven all proposed alternatives, including special creation.
So today I have another 5 failed predictions of cosmic evolution.
I would argue that none of these are predictions of cosmic evolution, but okay. Also, I don't know what the first 5 are. I don't particularly care, and unless this video does better than normal, I don't plan to go looking for them. So if you do want to see the other 5, I guess make sure you like this video, share it, and if you're not already subscribed, subscribe to the channel. All of that will boost this video on YouTube and signal to me that it's worth doing a follow-up.
And I have an article with 40 failed predictions, and that's not exhaustive, there's more. So
It might not be exhaustive, but it sounds exhausting.
This sounds like you've done some pretty extensive research into this. So what are actually the 5 failed predictions today then?
We went over this already. I'm going to skip. But before I skip, I'd like to once again ask you to like this video and leave a comment and share the video. All of those help spread this video in the algorithm, which has not been kind to me this year. Also, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on notifications. It will increase the chances that both you and others will be recommended my videos, and it helps grow the channel. If the channel doesn't grow, it'll shrink, and I'll eventually have to stop doing this. I want to keep making videos like this for as long as possible, ideally for the rest of my time on Earth. Help me out. It won't cost you anything, but you'll be supporting science communication and helping combat pseudoscience.
So if we get it started and kicked off, carbon-14 and diamonds. Carbon-14 shouldn't exist in diamonds based on cosmic evolution. How does that stand up?
Well, it's just not true. Carbon-14 is produced when cosmic rays strike nitrogen in the atmosphere, and that's the source that gives us the carbon-14 that we use for carbon dating. But other sources of carbon-14 exist, including those produced by both thermal and fast neutrons, and underground there are in fact neutron sources from things like spontaneous fission, which means that we should expect that any underground carbon should have some small amount of carbon-14. Finding it is just finding what physics says we should find, and is entirely consistent with an ancient age of the Earth.
Well, the diamonds are supposed to be 1 to 3 billion years old. That's 1,000 millions. A huge age they're supposed to be.
That's a pretty good estimate, but it's actually not always clear how old diamonds are. But they're older than this guy thinks the whole universe is, so it doesn't matter much.
And in which case there could not be any carbon-14 present in them.
Why not? There won't be any cosmogenic carbon-14 most likely. But why wouldn't there be other carbon-14? Oh, right, it's because if you ignore other sources of carbon-14, then you can pretend that this is a problem for science.
Because carbon-14 is a radioactive element that decays away quite quickly. 5,730 years, half it disappears.
Yep.
Which means that after even 100,000 years, there'll be nothing left.
Nope, so the formula to see how much would be left is the initial amount times 0.5 raised to the power of the number of half-lives elapsed. That's 0.000558% remaining. Now that's not much, but it's not actually zero. The half-life calculation never actually goes to zero. Now in reality, the amount of carbon-14 in any object is going to be an integer number of atoms. So eventually you'll get down to the last such atom if there is no new source of carbon-14. But how long will that last one atom last? Well, after one half-life, or 5,370 years, the chances that the atom will have decayed is 50%. But let's say it lasts that long. What are the chances that it will last another 5,370 years? Well, it's 50% again. From the outset, you can say that the chances of a single atom of carbon-14 decaying over a given period of time is equal to 50% times the half-life raised to the number of elapsed half-lives, which you might notice is the same calculation as before. So the chances of a single carbon-14 atom that you're watching persisting over 100,000 years is also 0.000558%, which again is not zero. It will never be zero. Now, it is likely that a source of carbon-14 will have no remaining individual atoms of carbon-14 after 100 millennia, if there's no source of new carbon-14, but we can't say that for sure.
Well, when you've got a billion years, there's no way in the world there could be any left.
Yes, there is. It's just fantastically unlikely. But I'm tired of beating this dead horse. It's been dead for a long while now.
And here's the thing, you can't contaminate a diamond with carbon-14 after it's made.
Why not? No reason. Now, you can't realistically wash in carbon-14 dissolved in water or something like that, but neutrons can absolutely fly right into a diamond and convert a carbon-13 atom into a carbon-14 atom. Neutrons are minuscule compared to the gaps in between carbon atoms in the crystal matrix of a diamond. To a neutron, a diamond is less like a solid object and more like the net at the back of a soccer goal to a mosquito. It's trivially easy to fly through. Now, if that mosquito were restricted to flight in a single direction and it had to pass through a few trillion nets, all of which were subtly offset from the original by some amount, then chances are it would eventually hit some net. That's basically what's going on with neutrons and diamonds. Unless you have a good reason to exclude neutrons from the mix, we don't have a good reason to say that diamonds should be completely absent carbon-14. Although, they should have very little, and in fact, they do. So little that we use things like diamond and coal as our background sources for carbon-14 to calibrate machines looking for the stuff. That's because it's hard to imagine a source of carbon that would have lower levels of carbon-14. But we don't expect any source to have literally zero. And if a carbon source had zero, how would you know? No measurement machine is free of noise, so you're not going to get a reading of absolutely zero. But does that respond to zero carbon-14, or just an amount that isn't really distinguishable from background noise? I don't know. And especially since no mass spectrometer has a perfect vacuum pump to remove literally every last speck of carbon-14 from the test chamber, how do you know if the signal you're seeing isn't residual? Again, you don't. That's why we don't use carbon dating on very old carbon sources, because it becomes impossible to distinguish from noise. That's all Batten is doing here. He's pointing out sources of noise and then pretending that because the measurements are noisy, that therefore they're completely unreliable. But all measurements have noise. Even using a ruler has noise. Rulers expand and contract with things like temperature, and different parts of a ruler can even be at different temperatures, meaning the expansion and contraction won't be even across its whole length. And most people aren't even going to account for temperature when measuring how long, say, a pencil is with a ruler. And that's to say nothing of the fact that most of them aren't graded finely enough to give you exact error-free measurements down to the Planck length anyway. Does that mean that rulers don't work? No, but it does mean that they have limitations. But pretending that limitations means rulers don't work is absurd.
And so why is that so problematic with this sort of idea?
Well, the thing is that anybody who's done high school biology or high school science would know that carbon in a diamond is a crystal structure and it's a lattice, and every spot is taken up with a carbon. That's why it's so hard.
No, that's not how real natural diamonds are. If every spot was taken up by carbon, that would be a sure sign of the diamond being artificial. In the real world, diamonds have impurities, that is, non-carbon atoms that take up what would normally be the spot of a carbon atom. Also, some spots in the lattice will be imperfect with a missing spot. Nature can produce well-ordered crystals, but it has not been known to produce perfectly ordered crystals.
And so you can't put carbon into it after it's made. So if the diamonds are 1 to 3 billion years old, you can't put carbon-14 into it in the last 50,000 years. You can't put it into it any time after it's made.
Except that you can, easily, and via processes that we know happen underground.
So how can it be billions of years old if it has carbon-14 present?
We generally actually can't be terribly sure if a diamond or bit of coal has any, because the measured amount is pretty similar to background. And also, there are indeed mechanisms that can produce carbon-14 underground inside diamonds or coal. That's the whole answer. After this, there's a bit of a commercial. I don't let creationists advertise on my channel, so we're skipping it.
So moving on to sort of the next idea then with carbon-14 as well, with coal, how does that work as well?
It's literally the same thing. I don't even know why this is a separate point that he's making, but who knows, maybe he'll say something different besides just, if it's old, it shouldn't have carbon-14 in it. One group of people who definitely do have carbon-14 in them is my patrons on Patreon. This channel depends on the support of viewers like you, and Patreon is far and away the best way to support the channel. If you value what I do here and want me to be able to keep making content like this, please check out the Patreon and consider joining for as little as $1 a month. There's a 15% discount if you pledge annually, and you get early access to my scripted videos like this one, access to my supporters-only Discord, which might be one of the most supportive communities I've ever seen, as well as a community full of cat pics, and also occasionally lizard, dog, and turtle pics. And you can also get access to higher perks at higher tiers, including Blender files and having me say your name in the end credits.
Well, it's a similar problem in that the coal is supposed to be anything from 10 to over 300 million years old, in which case there'd be no carbon-14 left in it if the carbon-14 was there at the beginning.
Why not? There won't be any cosmogenic carbon-14 most likely. But why wouldn't there be other carbon-14? Oh, right, it's because if you ignore other sources of carbon-14, then you can pretend that this is a problem for science.
Now, so some people try to explain this by contamination, but we'll get onto that.
Well, contamination is certainly more likely in coal than in diamond. It's also not strictly necessary.
But coal, we've found carbon-14 in every coal sample that's ever been looked at.
I'd love a citation on that, but oh well.
Right. So it's in every single bit of coal, even though it shouldn't be there.
Yeah, so basically when scientists were developing the carbon-14 dating system many decades ago, they wanted a organic sample which they could process, put through the processing that's used for carbon dating, and with something with no carbon-14 present. So they could check how much carbon-14 they were adding during the processing or the preparation of the samples.
This is essentially a calibration step. You'll be familiar with this if you use a kitchen scale to measure things. Generally, you don't want to simply dump ingredients onto the scale. You put them in a container. But the problem is that you don't want the mass of the container to count towards your measurement. So first you place the container on the scale, then you hit the button to tare the scale. That is, set it so that whatever it reads now is set to 0. In other words, you need to know what 0 actually looks like. We use things like diamond and coal as our background sources for carbon-14 to calibrate machines looking for the stuff. That's because it's hard to imagine a source of carbon that would have lower levels of carbon-14. But we don't expect any source to have literally 0. And if a carbon source had 0, how would you know? No measurement machine is free of noise, so you're not going to get a reading of absolutely 0. But does that respond to 0 carbon-14, or just an amount that isn't really distinguishable from background noise? I don't know, and especially since no mass spectrometer has a perfect vacuum pump to remove literally every last speck of carbon-14 from the test chamber, how do you know if the signal you're seeing isn't residual? Again, you don't. That's why we don't use carbon dating on very old carbon sources, because it becomes impossible to distinguish from noise. That's all Batten is doing here. He's pointing out sources of noise and then pretending that because the measurements are noisy, that therefore they're completely unreliable. But all measurements have noise. Even using a ruler has noise. Rulers expand and contract with things like temperature, and different parts of a ruler can even be at different temperatures, meaning the expansion and contraction won't be even across its whole length. And most people aren't even going to account for temperature when measuring how long, say, a pencil is with a ruler. And that's to say nothing of the fact that most of them aren't graded finely enough to give you exact error-free measurements down to the Planck length anyway. Does that mean that rulers don't work? No, but it does mean that they have limitations. But pretending that limitations means rulers don't work is absurd.
So they said, oh, we'll go and get some coal because it's obviously got no carbon-14 in it because it's millions of years old.
Nope, because it won't likely have any cosmogenic carbon-14. Not that it won't have any. But if it has some, that means that there is a background rate of production from other sources that you don't want included in your data as a signal, just like you don't want the weight of your container affecting the weight reading of your ingredients on your kitchen scale.
And they got a sample of coal and it had carbon-14 present.
Well, it gave a non-zero reading, which we know isn't a guarantee of actual carbon-14, because noise exists. Even things as simple as electromagnetic waves inducing minute voltages in the instrumentation can cause noise. There simply is no way to ensure that your machine will never give back a positive value for carbon-14, even if it's got an empty test chamber. That being said, I do actually expect that coal has some radiogenic carbon-14.
And they've been looking ever since for a sample with no carbon-14 and no one's found any.
No, they haven't, because it's not even physically possible to make that determination. A sample that will return literally 0 as the reading without calibration is on the same level as a pump that will create a perfect vacuum or an engine that is perfectly efficient. It's not actually possible in the real world, so no one is really looking for one.
In fact, there was a paper written in the Radiocarbon Journal many years ago now where they were basically putting out the fact that they've been unable to find any samples of coal with no carbon-14.
Just a paper, huh? From many years ago. So, no author or publication date. Meaning that if I want to check on this claim, I get to sift through 66 years of papers. I don't make enough from these videos for that to be viable. What is so hard about giving a journal author name, or names, and a publication date? Oh, right. Then, people could actually search for the source and find out that it does nothing to support the pseudoscience being spouted. It's like when an anti-Semite says that something is in the Talmud, as if that's not two different collections, each of which takes up a whole bookshelf.
And that's so interesting. And so with carbon-14 being in coal, is it just like crazy sort of erratic amounts of carbon-14 in there, or is it looking kind of nice and uniform?
It's fairly consistent, actually, which is It's consistent with the coal forming from vegetation buried during Noah's flood.
No, it's not. If that were the case, then we would expect such coal to have 58% of its cosmogenic carbon-14 present, not trace amounts. Remember, the formula is 0.5 raised to the power of the number of elapsed half-lives, and I'm assuming 4,500 years ago as the date of the flood. 4,500 divided by 5,730 means that we're raising 0.5 to the power of about 0.785.
And so how does that work then with carbon-14 being in coal and Noah's flood? What does that sort of look like? How would that process work?
Well, here's the thing. When you look at those coal samples, which are supposed to be anything from 10 to 300, over 300 million years old, they all have a similar amount of carbon-14 in them.
And not enough to be young enough to have all formed in a single flood event. So it's almost like there's some subterranean process which might produce trace amounts of carbon-14, which, when combined with noise from the instruments, means that really nothing unusual is happening here. This is like someone staring at the static of an old rabbit ear TV and thinking that there must be a static channel broadcasting somewhere. Otherwise, why would there be static?
Now, according to the carbon-14 dating, that's like 30 to 40,000 years old, and that's too old for Noah's flood, but we'll deal with that.
It's also getting to the point where that's the same thing as just saying it's too old for carbon dating to be reliable. Look, if you put a 50 kilo weight on your kitchen scale that maxes out at 300 grams and it reads 300 grams, that doesn't mean that your 50 kilo weight has become lighter. It means you've hit the maximum reading on the scale. That's what we're talking about when we're in the 30 to 50,000 year range with carbon dating. Hypothetically, we could extend it to about 50,000 years, but in practical terms, well before that, the signal is so small compared to the noise that it's hard to distinguish between the two with any particular confidence. And so such ages should be treated as basically all being really old, and so old you should use a different dating technique.
But the fact that there's a consistent amount, similar amount, is consistent with it all being formed by the same process, which would be vegetation buried during Noah's flood and then form coal.
Except that it's even more compatible with just processes that create non-cosmogenic carbon-14 at low levels. Especially since the proposed alternative in this case is physically impossible for about 1 million reasons, chief among them that the event would not be a flood, but instead would release so much energy that the Earth would mostly vaporize, which would make it hard for coal to form in the first place. This is the well-known heat problem. So, I'm sorry, but you don't get to ignore a well-understood process that adequately explains the data in favor of a physically impossible mechanism that you only believe in because one internally contradictory book that we know to be historically inaccurate in many, although not all parts, said that that physically impossible thing happened.
Since then.
But surely, I mean, evolutionists will have an answer for this. What do they commonly say?
What I just said would probably be my biggest response. That there is no anomaly. The data is as expected based on our current understanding, and that tossing that out in favor of impossible nonsense is absurd on its face, and does not warrant further consideration by anyone serious about learning, the truth, scholarship, or even just the well-being of the human race. But if pushed, I'd go on about radiogenic sources of carbon-14, noisy measurements, contamination, etc.
Well, there's 3 go-to attempts to answer this, because you couldn't possibly accept this evidence, because otherwise you stop believing in the millions and billions of years. So the first one is contamination. That's the usual go-to.
Is it? Because when I talk to people who actually use carbon dating, they don't normally talk about contamination much in this context, except when a sample might give a very young age, which is not what Batten is talking about, but sure, why not?
And the idea is that these samples have been contaminated, and they have to be contaminated in recent times. You can remember that carbon-14 would all decay away in something like 50 or 60,000 years. You don't be able to measure any. Certainly 100,000 years, you can't measure anything. There's nothing there.
Well, given that they're being dug up in the present, recent contamination seems very plausible.
So, consequently, the contamination has to be recent. And all these samples that are supposed to be over 300 million years, or the diamonds can't be contaminated, so that rules that out with diamonds.
He's spending a lot of time on a supposed explanation that I don't actually see being used much about this topic, except when the ages are younger than we're usually getting. But whatever, I guess.
So the contamination thing, though, is checked in the process of carbon dating. So in the laboratory, they check what's called carbon-13, carbon-12 ratio. Sounds technical, and it is.
Maybe I'm just out of touch, but I don't really see what's so technical about the fact that isotopes can be in different ratios. But yes, it turns out that biological sources of carbon tend to have a slightly different ratio of carbon isotopes to non-biological sources. And coal readily absorbs carbon sources, like humic acids, which can throw off the non-radioactive carbon ratio. Here, I think it would be worthwhile to directly quote a friend of mine, John, who is in fact a geologist who studies relatively young structures in caves and who works with carbon dating as a regular part of his job. The carbon-13 to 12 ratio is always measured in tandem with carbon-14, because radiocarbon ages assume the value is negative 25 per mil, similar to most vegetation. If it is not minus 25, limestone would be close to 0 per mil by definition. A correlation is made to account for the effects of isotopic fractionation. If you are radiocarbon dating organic matter, that should have a low carbon-13 to 12 ratio. But instead, you get a high value, it would indicate that the carbon being measured is not from organic matter. One example of this can be found in the results of young Earth creationists dating dinosaur bones. Most of the carbon-13 ratios are too high to be organics, such as collagen. Hence, the carbon signal is obviously from the atmosphere or carbonate mineral. That being said, your contamination could have the same value as your target. If you try to date petrified wood, like an idiot, you'd probably still get a value close to that of trees, because humic acids have the same isotope signature. So, carbon-13 to 12 can help detect contamination, but it's not definitive by itself. I'm not sure the creationists have ever tried to date the coal themselves, just cited from published studies. Coal can often give finite ages under 50,000 years, but we think that's due to its affinity to trap humic acids that can't be washed off in pre-treatment.
But why do they do that? They do that because if the carbon-14 comes from organic material from plants, which all of it has to, because photosynthesis locks it into food and then things eat the plants, and so the animal that eats the plant has the same carbon-14 that the plant had, and similar to algae in the ocean, and fish eat the algae and they get the carbon-14 from the algae.
Actually, the ocean is a well-known reservoir of old, that is carbon-14 depleted carbon, because the carbon in the ocean is mostly recycled and not primarily drawn from the atmosphere. That's why sea life is usually not carbon dated, because it will give anomalously old ages due to the reservoir effect. Similarly, organisms near roadsides or fossil fuel burning power plants tend to absorb carbon-14 depleted carbon from those fossil fuels, and also tend to give very old ages. These are known limitations that scientists who do carbon dating are well aware of.
It's all from photosynthesis, but the different plants and algae have a different enzymes which take up the CO2, the carbon dioxide, and they discriminate against something which is not carbon-12. So carbon-12 is a normal carbon dioxide, carbon-14 is radioactive carbon dioxide, and carbon-13, though, is also different to carbon-12, but it's slightly heavier. And the enzyme discriminates against the carbon-13 carbon dioxide. And the carbon-13 carbon-12 ratio is constant. It doesn't decay like the carbon-14 does.
There is discrimination, although I think it's important to note that the discrimination isn't perfect, and carbon-13 is indeed incorporated into plants.
And so you can look at the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 and you can see that the organic matter that's being checked for carbon-14 hasn't been contaminated. It's actually from plants. It's actually, in fact, there's two different sorts of plants in terms of the chemistry of photosynthesis. You can even tell which sort of plant it is or whether it's algae.
Right, yes.
So
yeah, but what if your coal is contaminated by humic acids that are the result of recent plant death? Then all of a sudden you have coal with a false low age and a carbon ratio that would be expected of intrinsic carbon-14 from the original plants, and the ratio won't help you. You'll actually have to do things like chemical analysis.
Is it contamination? No, clearly not contamination. That's checked for in the actual process of carbon dating.
No, it's not clearly not contamination because some contamination has the same carbon ratio as the target sample. There is no one-size-fits-all test for contamination. You actually have to do a lot of other checks if you have reason to suspect contamination.
Right, so number one, is it contaminated? You can test for that and the answer is no.
No, not contamination.
Not contaminated.
Nope, that's not a safe conclusion.
Well, there's two more options. What are the other two options?
So the second option is uranium can decay to produce some carbon-14. So the normal uranium decay chain takes you through to lead, but there's a side chain with a tiny, tiny percentage of it can actually go to carbon-14.
Okay.
And we'll also forget about radiogenic carbon-14 produced by neutron flux, I guess. One group that we'll never forget about neutron flux are my channel members. If you like what I'm doing and you want to support it, please consider joining the channel memberships. It starts at only $1.99 a month US and gives you all the benefits of the Patreon, less the Blender files, but also gets you access to a special badge in chat, a green name to highlight your support, channel emojis, and one membership chat per month at no extra charge.
So the idea is that there's contamination or small amounts of uranium in the actual samples, in the vegetation which became coal or whatever, which has produced the carbon-14. Now, again, it has to happen in the last 50,000 years.
Yeah, but is Don about to tell us that he doesn't think uranium has decayed in the last 50,000 years?
So if this happened, a million years ago, it's not going to help.
Doesn't matter anymore.
And here's the problem. It's such a tiny amount of carbon-14 produced by the uranium decay that for it to produce enough carbon-14 to be significant, to be measurable, to give you a carbon-14 age, the sample would have to be 99% uranium.
Right, and we're pretty sure when we're dealing with coal,
it's not uranium. It's not uranium.
It's not uranium.
Exactly right.
So,
which is probably why no one really talks about uranium decay when they talk about coal radiocarbon content. But yeah, I guess I agree. In cases where the coal is measured at a low age, well under 50,000 years, that carbon-14 in the coal is not primarily generated by uranium decay into carbon-14.
So that doesn't work.
We have a bit of a problem there then. So it can't be contaminated. We know it's not contaminated. We can test that.
Actually, no, we don't know that, because the specific contamination that we know is likely in coal cannot be detected by carbon isotopic ratio measurements. In fact, coal is somewhat frequently contaminated without ever changing its isotopic ratios for stable carbon.
We know it's not 99% uranium, so it's not producing carbon-14 through that method.
That's true.
What is their final option?
The third one is that the normal process of production of carbon-14 in the atmosphere is that a nitrogen-14 is hit by a neutron, a cosmic ray type of thing, in the upper atmosphere, and the neutron's absorbed by the nitrogen and produces carbon-14.
Let's not forget that this also results in a free proton that's ejected from the nucleus. You can't just change a nucleus from nitrogen to carbon without changing the number of protons, specifically because the number of protons is what defines what element an atom is.
So that's how carbon-14 is normally produced. The idea is that nitrogen in the vegetation, which has become coal, had some nitrogen in it, and nearby some radioactive decay of other material produced neutrons which bombarded the nitrogen and made it into carbon-14. That's how you got the carbon-14 in the sample. It has to happen, all has to happen recently. It's no good at it happening millions of years ago. It has to happen in the last 50,000 years.
Actually, carbon-14 can also be produced by interactions with carbon-13 and oxygen-17. Now, those are much less likely because the other nuclides have much smaller cross-sections for thermal neutron capture, but it still happens, and neutrons can be produced by long-lived nuclides underground at a fairly constant rate, although this is more a factor for diamond than coal. When coal is measured to be young, the primary source of carbon-14 in the coal is actually contamination with atmospherically produced carbon-14. Cross-section in this case is a bit of an abstraction, but it ends up with units of distance squared, and it relates to how likely a nucleus is to interact with a particular particle in a particular way given a particular particle flux. Particle flux is a measure of the number of particles in a given two-dimensional area at a given time. It has units of distance to the -2, or per unit area.
And what's the chances of that happening?
It's not terribly high under any circumstances, but it's never zero, and it varies.
Pretty low.
Very, very low. And it would produce such a tiny amount it wouldn't be significant.
Generally true, which is why no one really cares about it in the context of coal with a low measured age. But for diamond, it actually is a significant part of the radiocarbon content, which in diamonds is always very low.
And also, if this was an explanation for the carbon-14 present, you would expect the amount of carbon-14 to be proportional to the amount of nitrogen in the sample.
Yes.
Yep, and because this isn't a major source of carbon-14 in coal with young measured ages, we're skipping him explaining that because frankly I'm tired of him arguing against strawman that I've already explained.
Right, so we've got three options, two of which are sort of outright wrong, and one that would be, you would have to have a very specific scenario for it to work, and it's not looking very likely.
No, we have two that are very unlikely and one that's very, very common, and that Don has told lies about, and that neatly explains why coal sometimes returns radiocarbon ages in the 30 to 50,000 year range.
So overall, there's no real explanation for this that has come forward that has been compelling at all.
There's no explanation that works.
All right, guys. Sometimes you are wrong in life.
In fact, I had a meeting with a bunch of scientists in Adelaide, 2023, and they were very resistant to the idea the Earth could be young.
I mean, for about the same reason they'd be very resistant to the idea that the Earth could be flat. It's not a possibility open to us. All observations are either only consistent with an ancient Earth or are non-dispositive and so can't help us answer the question. Even without radiometric dating, which involves many things that can measure ages much older than carbon dating, just sedimentology on its own would demonstrate that at a minimum the Earth is around 1,000 times older than young Earth creationists think it is. Young Earth and flat Earth only differ in terms of popularity, funding, and how easy it is to check on without specialized equipment. They are sides of the same coin.
So and when I brought up the question of carbon dating and how strong evidence against their belief for millions and billions of years, they were very resistant to the idea.
Well, yeah, because it's not a problem at all for the age of the Earth, and telling lies about coal and diamonds doesn't change that. This is the same thing as Roger Spur of Mud Fossil U complaining that academics won't listen to him and eventually block him when he keeps asking them to look into his caves are vaginas theory.
In fact, they're a bit hostile.
Imagine feeling hostile towards someone who says that more or less all of science is wrong and doing it with lies. What a weird reaction. They should be welcoming misinformation with open arms. It's not like getting science wrong is currently getting people killed or anything.
But their go-to was contamination.
Imagine that. Their go-to was the thing we know it to be with high confidence. It's like when globeheads go to sunset to show the Earth isn't flat. How silly of them.
Yes.
Contamination. And I explained how the carbon-14 dating system works and how it's checked for in the process of processing the samples.
So I can't verify what happened in that room, but what is being described is a man with no expertise in a field walking into a room full of experts, explaining something they're all aware of, then telling them that they're all wrong because of the very test that they themselves do showing them wrong. Then the people who, let's be clear, know more than either he or I do, not being very impressed by his very, very obviously wrong critique. Basically, he's pulling a Richard Carrier and complaining that actually his work has passed peer review because it's actually right for real, you guys, all while the actual experts laugh him out of the room. Don Batten is not a serious man. I'd call him the Richard Carrier of creationism, but as we all know, it's actually Kent, because both Kent and Carrier have abuse allegations. And in the case of Kent, there's a conviction, which to my knowledge has not been overturned.
And the most vocal opponent of what I was talking about went very silent. And he privately emailed me later and said that's very powerful evidence against millions and billions of years.
I'll take things that never happened for 500. What's his name? Show us the email. Look, I can do this too. I was in a room full of CMI scientists, and I presented the heat problem to all of them. And one of my most vocal critics in that room of CMI scientists just fell silent. Later, I got an email telling me that he actually was now an old earther who accepted universal common ancestry, but he couldn't tell anyone lest he become unemployed.
So the people who, some of the comments on the internet about our material on carbon dating have put forward, oh, you don't understand carbon dating, it's residual, which means it's contamination.
Which is where the evidence points. Yes.
These people making these statements actually don't understand the carbon dating process.
Just like the experts don't, apparently. But thank God we have Don Batten, plant physiologist, to set us straight. And if you don't believe he's actually more of an expert than all the experts who do this for a living and have spent most of their adult lives working on it, well, he has an email from someone who he says is an expert, but he won't say who, and he won't show the email, it seems.
Good Lord, why do you think carbon dating demonstrates a young Earth?
An email from an expert says so?
Uh-huh. An email from an unnamed expert, an expert in radiometric dating, from Australia, in your email inbox, and it says that the Earth is young.
Yes.
May I see it?
No.
because it's checked for in the way in which the samples are dealt with in the lab for carbon dating.
Yes, it's checked for in a way that can detect non-plant derived carbon. But if the contamination is derived from plants, like it is in humic acids, which are already absorbed by coal, then simple carbon isotope measurements won't detect that. And we know that modern coal can be contaminated with humic acids because we can extract them from the coal chemically.
So this is a big thorn in the side, the carbon-14 problem.
No, it's not. It's a made-up thorn that the scientists don't even notice because it's not real. It's just a pile of coke from creationists upset that all of science demonstrates how completely absurd their ideas are.
For those people who think this is a long, long period of time, billions of years, natural processes, where this sort of doesn't really line up particularly well with that entire idea.
Except it does line up, and nothing being said here at all contradicts that. Once again, we're back to Roger Spur complaining that scientists won't listen to him even though he has brilliantly discovered that photons have parts, and that electrons are actually recursive. The reason no one takes this seriously is that it's not serious. This is at the same intellectual level as me as a child watching cashiers hand money back to my mom at the grocery store, and wondering why poor people don't just get some money from the cashiers. Because I neither understood the amount of money being exchanged each way, nor the concept of returning the difference as change after handing over too much cash. My excuse was that I had only been part of human society for like 4 years or something, and was very dumb. I'm not sure what Dr. Don Batten's excuse is. It's probably just dishonesty, since he's at least smart enough to get a PhD, so it's hard to chalk it up to just being an idiot.
It should be a thorn in their side, but they give trite answers.
Yeah, and they give trite answers to Don because he's clearly not coming at this in good faith, but rather he's coming at it with a dogmatic conclusion reached without evidence and maintained despite both figurative and literal mountains of evidence to the contrary. And of course, even if he is right about radiocarbon dating, it would mean that that technique is not reliable. It wouldn't mean that the Earth is young, because that's still precluded by, again, those mountains, both metaphorical and real, of evidence to the contrary. And of course, he's not right.
But if they go into it and actually research it, it is a huge problem for the millions of years story.
Is that what someone who researches this will find? Because it seems like when people research it for decades, that pretty uniformly they come to the opposite conclusion. Weird how that works. But also, this is a do-your-own-research line, once again cementing young Earth creationism alongside anti-vax, 9/11 truthers, birthers, flat earthers, living water guys, homeopaths, chiropractors, acupuncturists, and the rest.
A huge problem.
How much time would that actually shave off of their sort of time scale if what you're saying is true?
None, because the parsimonious explanation is that there is something we fundamentally do not understand about carbon-14, not that the Earth is young. A lot more work in radiology, particle physics, biology, sedimentology, astrophysics, thermodynamics, etc. would have to be completely wrong in order for the likely explanation to become a young Earth. When all the lines of evidence point in one direction, and the lines of evidence are myriad, one single line of evidence changing which way it points isn't enough to change the conclusion. Don't get me wrong, it would be a start, and if Don were right, I'd suggest that creationists proceed from there. But of course, he's not, and if he were, the biggest change would be to invalidate all those cool biblical archaeology dates that Christians love, because they show that some parts of the Bible were not just made up, which they do. The Bible is not all made up. Some of the stuff in there is based on real events that really happened to the people named in the Bible.
Well, you think about the diamonds, 1 to 3 billion years, and if they're dated at, the dating is 40 or 50,000 years.
In other words, too old to be reliably dated, since 50,000 years is the theoretical maximum, and 30,000 is about the practical maximum in most cases. So you know exactly what you'd expect to get from a sample that has no measurable cosmogenic carbon-14.
That takes off billions of years of time.
No, it does not.
We're working in the tens of thousands of years then, aren't we?
Yeah, this gets rid of billions of years.
It doesn't, but even if it did, it would leave the Earth as at least an order of magnitude too old for young Earth creationism. I love that the best attempt Don has to discredit science is just lies about carbon dating, that even if they weren't lies, would still leave carbon dating as precluding young Earth creationism. How pathetic can you get?
I mean, the coal, as we said, is 10 to 300 million years old, and it brings it all into the last 40,000 years or so, according to their own dating.
Which again is outside the range of most carbon dating, even if it is within the theoretical maximum that we might be able to get under ideal conditions. And coal is not an ideal target for carbon dating because of how readily coal will absorb contaminants with the same carbon-12 and 13 ratio as plant matter.
This gets rid of deep time. It effectively gets rid of deep time.
I guess it depends on what you mean by deep time. I consider anything before the Neolithic as deep time. That's about 12,000 years ago. But hey, that's just me. Maybe Don thinks it's 1,000,000 years ago. It's not like there's a formal definition for it, but it still leaves a universe that's many times older than Don thinks it is.
And yeah, that's so interesting. So we're still working with tens of thousands of years, though. And how does that line up with biblical accounts of time if we look at, genealogies and whatnot?
It doesn't.
Yeah, we look at of course, the biblical time frame is shorter than 40 or 50,000 years. So how does it compute?
It doesn't.
Well, with the carbon dating, what they do is they've got a calibration in historical times, which makes it quite useful in archaeology, or even there, sometimes it gets strange results. So they never take it in isolation. It's always in the context of what we know about the history.
And other dating techniques like electron spin resonance, racemization dating, dendrochronology, sedimentology, ice core dating, etc. And you know what's cool about that? They all point to an Earth that's far older than young Earth creationists think it is. If you remove one of those, the whole thing doesn't collapse. It's much more likely that we were just wrong about the reliability of one of our techniques.
So in archaeological times, we can calibrate it, but once you go past that, when you start talking about 10, 20, 30, 40,000 years,
we can still calibrate it because of things like dendrochronology, uranium-thorium dating, etc. Turns out that calibration for carbon curves is actually something that is routinely done well outside the range of time that young Earth creationists think is reasonable.
It's just a straight line extrapolation back into the past.
No, it's not, and we know that because the rate of production of carbon-14 in the atmosphere has not been constant over the last 50,000 years or so. That's why carbon dating has calibration curves. We use samples from objects that can be directly dated with other techniques like varves, tree rings, or pollen in the ice cores. And since we know how old they are via even more reliable techniques with smaller error bars, we can use such things to calibrate the carbon dating, such that we can even account for the minute changes in the flux of cosmic radiation hitting Earth's upper atmosphere. The fact that Don doesn't seem to know even this fairly basic fact about the technique further cements that he simply does not know what he's talking about or is lying.
Yeah.
In other words, it's totally assumed.
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea what he just said. I've listened to it about a dozen times, and what I hear is animalids are totally assumed. I have no fucking clue what that means.
Well, is that valid? They don't take account of the fact that Noah's flood was a global flood.
Yes, and they also don't take into account the fact that pixie dust is full of stasis fields that preserve carbon-14, or that Trazyn the Infinite likes to sprinkle carbon all over the place, or that gravity is fake, or the meddling of Q. If you want scientists to take something into account, the first step is ensuring that that thing isn't physically impossible. That ship has already sailed for the flood. We know that it is physically impossible as creationists propose it to have happened. The second step is to show that it happened, and we know it didn't.
And that would have a major effect on the carbon dating system.
So would all the things I mentioned. And we have just as much reason to think that Trazyn the Infinite is messing with us as we do to think that there was a worldwide flood messing with us. And yes, this might be an excuse for me to reference the best thing the infamous Matt Ward ever created.
Yes.
And also, if you look at the fact that prior to the flood, the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere was 15 times, at least 15 times what it is now.
Mm.
Do you think Don has anything to back that up? Because I don't.
And there's a secular view of, the Cambrian period.
He could just refer to the Cambrian system. That refers to the physical rocks themselves, not the time frame in which they are known to have been deposited, that Don rejects. Creationists can accept the Cambrian system as the name for a bunch of rocks whose physical existence they do not deny.
Had 15 times as much carbon dioxide as we have now.
I'd love to see a source for that, but regardless, carbon dating doesn't work for Cambrian rocks, and I'm not aware of any Cambrian coal. Now, there was a coal mine called the Cambrian Colliery, but it was named after the Cambrian region, another name for Wales, which has historically also been named Cambria, and is also the place that the Cambrian system and later Cambrian period were named for. But the coal there isn't Cambrian in age, so nothing about the Cambrian period or system are at all relevant to a discussion about coal. Also, Cambria is, in my opinion, a more appropriate name because it derives from the actual Welsh demonym for themselves and their land, Cymru, or Cymru. Sorry to any Welsh speakers for my butchering of your language. On the other hand, Wales comes from an Old English word that originally meant non-Germanic foreigner, but later became associated with Celtic peoples. As you might know, I prefer to use the names for people that they use for themselves, with allowances for the phonemic inventory and phonotactics of English.
So 15 times as much carbon dioxide is basically over 20,000 years of carbon dating because of the dilution effect on the carbon-14.
Yes, okay.
Okay, but so what? Why are we talking about the Cambrian? What coal is there from then that was carbon dated? Why is this even being brought up? I guess maybe he's saying that that represents the pre-flood world, and so all the creatures that died in the flood should have had that extra carbon-14, which would push their ages up 20,000 years? But that would still leave us with radiocarbon dates from coal that are thousands to tens of thousands of years too old for a young Earth creationist timeline. And on top of this, that argument assumes the flood, which is not only something we don't get to just assume, but which we have very firmly precluded. So he'd need to start there. Additionally, extra carbon in the atmosphere doesn't mean an extra abundance of carbon-14 relative to the amount of total carbon. So it's not actually obvious that this extra carbon in the atmosphere would affect the radiocarbon ages of plants growing in that atmosphere. Since he hasn't in any way demonstrated the flood is real, nor does his explanation actually predict the result he thinks it does, leaning on any of this to overturn science is just leaning on a fantasy to overturn hard evidence. That's not going to work to convince anyone who isn't either already convinced, entirely ignorant, or who desperately wants to believe. Also, why am I the one making this argument for him? Shouldn't he be the one actually telling us why Cambrian carbon dioxide levels are important at all? It feels like this isn't my job. Oh well, I guess I'm trying to be too charitable for some reason.
So it makes things look older. So you can lock 20 to 23, 24,000 years off those 40,000 year ages or whatever you like.
Which leaves them still too old.
Mm-hmm.
You take into account the dilution effect in Noah's flood. So you've got all this vegetation buried during Noah's flood, which became the coal we're talking about.
Of course, that's another physical impossibility, because there's too much coal for all the plants to produce it to have fit on Earth during only a year. We'd need several Earths covered from pole to pole in plants to get that much plant matter. Remember, the volume of coal is much, much smaller than the volume of the plant matter that produced it.
And then after the flood, there's a regrowth of the vegetation, sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere.
Actually, no, that would also be impossible since that would have salted the whole Earth. So only halophilic plants could grow, and they tend not to have prodigious growth rates. You'd think a plant physiologist might have realized this.
The radical effect on the carbon dating system.
Just, not one that solves the problems that Don has made for himself.
Right.
So you take these two things into account, you can quickly start to see how those dates come back into a biblical time frame.
Yeah, unless you actually do the math. Even his explanation didn't do that at all. Is he even trying? If I were a creationist, I'd find this insulting. But then again, I guess it remains true that no one has more contempt for and a lower opinion of their audience than young Earth creationists. But that's it. After this, we just get...
That's actually amazing. So that we've cut down from billions of years to a few thousand.
Yeah.
So, Don, what's the third failed prediction then?
Of course, the third failed prediction, which would at best actually be the first, is a story for next time. This was spectacularly disappointing. Also, am I the only one who thinks that coal and diamonds really should have been one topic rather than two? I mean, they're both basically the same thing. Lies about carbon dating. It's weird to split them up. It's like Batten is padding out his numbers. Oh well, I suppose that's his business, not mine.
Well, the prediction is that folded rocks around the world give evidence that they were hard when they were folded.
I mean, is that really a prediction? It seems more like a conclusion. There's no rule that says uplift and folding have to happen only after lithification of rocks. By the way, lithification is the process of turning loose sediments into hard rock. It happens through a combination of squeezing out water and chemical cementing in the grains left behind. It greatly reduces the volume of the sediment and greatly increases its hardness.
Right. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Well, if you think about the rock, the deep time idea of rocks being laid down, layer after layer after layer like this, and then you find all around the world radical bending of these rock layers. So clearly all the stuff was laid down before it was folded, before it was bent.
What he's describing there, with sediment being laid down, is Steno's principle of initial horizontality. Now, we know that there are circumstances that can cause diagonal or even vertical deposition, but those circumstances are uncommon and usually short-lived. Generally, sediment is laid down in horizontal layers.
Right.
But the time frame they put on this, again, the millions and billions of years idea, you've got tens and hundreds of millions of years of time laying down these layers before they're bent.
Well, that varies a lot. There's no rule about how long after deposition folding has to start. You need to assess each instance individually because such processes have different causes, start times, intensities, and durations. Nothing in geology is just a one-size-fits-all explanation. Earth is complex, and so are its rocks.
Yes.
In which case, at least the lower layers would have been hard rock at the time they were bent.
Again, this depends, but this is at least often the case.
Yeah, okay. That
So
makes sense.
how do you bend hard rock?
With pressure and heat. Rock is already bendable under standard conditions, but only to a limited degree. The plasticity of rock is a function of pressure and temperature, something we've known since the early 20th century. And when I say we've known, I mean there were experiments that literally bent rock. Don could do those experiments too if he wanted to. He doesn't. He wants to spread lies about the process of plastic deformation. Now, before any creationists get their panties all twisted, let me explain what I mean by a lie as a noun and lying as a verb. When I say that something is a lie, I mean that it is verifiably and demonstrably wrong. For instance, if you say that the Cybertruck will be remembered as a great vehicle in the decades to come, I think that's wrong, but I don't think it's a lie. Since I don't have a way to verify what's going to happen in the future. After all, Allahu Alam. But if you say that a dozen is more than a score, that's a lie. We can just check that answer and find that a dozen is a counting term for 12 and that a score is a counting term for 20. But if you say something that's a lie, that doesn't mean that you're lying as in the verb. At least not how I use it. For me, to lie is to intentionally attempt to deceive a person. Which means that for me to say that you are lying, I have to be convinced that you are attempting to convince a person of something you believe to be false, regardless of its actual falsity. So for example, if you're a flat earther and you try to convince someone that the earth is a globe, you're lying. Even if the things you're saying are actually true. On the other hand, if you're the guy telling me that a dozen is more than a score and you actually believe that, you're not lying, you're just mistaken. So when I say that Don is spreading lies, I am not saying that he is lying. Now, I'll be honest, I find it hard to think that he's not lying, but I don't yet have enough evidence to say that with any confidence. Mostly because nothing he's gone over in this series has been about his one field of expertise, the physiology of plants.
I don't know. Can you bend hard rock?
Well,
Yes, you can.
you can bend hard rock if you have enough force.
Okay.
But when you do that, the force is so extreme that it changes the nature of the rock.
This is simply not true under all conditions. Time is also a factor. Let's say it takes 20 seconds to push a wooden box 5 feet across a warehouse floor with 20 newtons of force, the force countering friction, resulting in a steady speed for the box when pushed, and for now ignoring static friction. If you then push with only 10 newtons of force, we should expect that the same trip will take, about 40 seconds. Since again, we're ignoring static friction for the sake of this example. Now, rock increases its plasticity as temperature and pressure go up, but it doesn't have zero plasticity at any temperature or pressure, which means that it can indeed bend under low pressure and relatively cool temperatures, provided that it is a relatively low force that's applied for a long time. So Don here is saying that rocks can only bend if they're hot enough to become metamorphic rock, but that's simply not true. In fact, we know it can happen slowly, which is why non-metamorphic bent sedimentary strata are actually evidence of the great antiquity of the Earth.
Right. So something becomes something else.
Yeah, so for example, sandstone becomes quartzite and limestone becomes marble.
Yep, like I said, his argument is that for the rocks to bend, they'd be in conditions that cause them to metamorphose.
And also you get sand grains will be distorted by the force.
That's true.
But it's only true in cases where the rock has actually become metamorphic.
And so you would also expect to find some cracking.
Which we do.
A lot of cracking from the bending of the rock. I mean, you bend hard rock, surely something's going to crack.
Yep.
You don't see much cracking.
Wrong.
In fact, cracking at both the macroscopic scale and the microscopic scale is extremely common in folded sediment that has not undergone metamorphic processes. The only creationist I can find who's doing research on this topic is Andrew Stelling, and the problem is that he just lies. This man has taken low-quality pictures of sedimentary folds in the Grand Canyon and said that they showed no evidence of major stress fractures. But there are people in his photos that are standing in front of the obviously visible stress fractures that even his shitty quality photography can't cover up. And when you check actual high-quality photographs of the same fold, not only do you see the cracks he was hiding, but there are far more smaller stress fractures that cut across the strata. There is no way I can chalk this up to just being a mistake. There is absolutely no explanation I can come up with that is both plausible and results in Andrew Snelling not being a liar. Now, Don here may not know this, since he's not a geologist, but he is at the very least spreading lies. If you disapprove of pretend geologists spreading lies about earth science, then please show me by liking this video and subscribing if you haven't already. Leave a comment letting me know how you feel about people who tell lies about science.
And so what's the other option here then? It had to be soft while bending. Is that more likely?
Well, the prediction is, of course, it was hard when it was bent, in which case it should leave telltale signs it was hard when it was bent.
And it does leave such telltale signs, such as microfractures and cementing agents, abrasion in the sediment grains in folded rock, relatively consistent strata thickness across the bed, and on either leg away from the bend, a lack of milky discoloration from different layers interfacing and partially mingling that you'd get if soft sediment were folding. Now, the degree to which sediment is soft or hard rock is called the level of lithification, and folding can occur at any level of lithification. So it's not like we're in a binary. But also, most folded rock shows that a lot of lithification happened before the folding, often complete lithification.
When you look at it, actually it looks like it was soft when it was bent.
All right.
Sometimes it does, as in this case, and soft folded rocks have a soupy appearance, with few if any cracks, significant variation in thickness in the strata, and often a whitish color at the boundary between layers. In contrast, look at this fold from the Carbon Canyon, part of the same rock system that makes up the sides of the Grand Canyon. And conveniently, the fold in the rock that Snelling decided to just lie about.
Foreshadowing is a narrative device.
You can see that this does not look soupy at all, and the rocks have many fractures and cracks, and also that the thickness of the strata is consistent through the folds. All of this indicates that folding must have happened slowly with lithified sediment at a relatively low temperature and pressure because it's not metamorphosed. The rock itself is impossible if young Earth creationism is even a bit true.
And has there been sort of any scientific research done on this?
Why, yes. Yes, there has, by many geologists, and the consensus is that the rocks on their own disprove that the Earth is young.
Yes, indeed. In fact, there's a major fold in the Grand Canyon called the Kaibab Upwarp, where virtually all the layers in the Grand Canyon are radically bent.
There sure is, and it shows every sign of having been a slow process.
Right.
And there's a fold connected with that called the Monument Fold, very thick layer of rock, it's radically bent.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Andrew Snelling, a geologist.
Andrew Snelling is a geologist the same way Andrew Wakefield is a doctor, or Donald Trump is a good businessman, or that Theranos had a reliable blood testing machine, or that Elon Musk is a guy who can tell the truth, or that Iraq was a country with weapons of mass destruction. I think you get what I mean.
I wanted to do a research project map to check whether it was hard when it was bent or whether it was soft.
Something that had already been checked on extensively and that was not an open question.
And so surely that's not something that's too difficult to get done then? You just go take a sample out?
You don't even need to do that. You can just look at it. Here's a picture of it. It very obviously was not soft when it formed. You can see the consistent thickness of the strata, the lack of mixing, and the ubiquitous fractures all over it. There is no question as to whether it was soft or hard when it formed. It was hard.
That's what she said.
Well, you have to get permission from the Parks Authority to do it.
And what kind of, did he run into some problems then?
He did, indeed. So he applied to the Parks Authority in 2013 to do the research. They refused to let him do it.
Yes, they did, and their stated reason is perfectly reasonable. Basically, they said that there was no reason to do destructive tests on rocks that had been so well characterized already to answer a question no one was asking. This was the correct response. It's the same reason that museums don't let people take apart their fossils to stupidly carbon date them, or that no one would let you tear down their walls just on the off chance that there was an alien body buried in the walls of their house. It was a stupid request to do a stupid bit of research that he just ended up lying about anyway.
They refused to let him get the samples.
They didn't let him get any samples.
No.
They didn't want him testing that.
No.
Which in retrospect was even more obviously the right decision. Look, the US Parks Department is in charge of the national parks, And if I can say one good thing about the former United States, it's that it has some of the best national parks on the planet. One of the most important jobs of the department is to balance the need for preservation of the parks with the need for scientific investigation. Most science involves destruction on some level. If everyone who wanted to take samples from the rocks of the Grand Canyon got to do so, then the natural landscape would just turn into a quarry. So they have to choose who to let take samples as to minimize the damage, but maximize the science. As a result, proposals that are seeking to damage the parks for trivial reasons, or answer questions that already have known answers, are generally rejected, as they should be. Andrew Snelling was proposing just this kind of study. Essentially, he was asking to come into the park and vandalize it, for no good reason.
That's not very open-minded of science there.
No, it's not very open-minded at all.
Yes, it is. If he had proposed to do work that actually answered real questions, even possibly, he'd have been given permission, as he had been in the past. Further, it's not science with a capital S that rejected him. It was the United States government, an organization which does not control science, and which routinely bends over backwards to accommodate even dangerous bullshit from Christian groups, including letting them cause outbreaks of deadly diseases, and even letting them just be in charge of what used to be the House of Representatives, back when the United States still had a constitution it was bothering to follow in any meaningful way.
And so, did he end up actually getting the sample then?
He did, and you'll never guess how.
Well, he did, but only after legal action. So a group that defends religious freedom in the United States, which is guaranteed under their constitution, sued the National Parks Authority for permission. It said there's viewpoint discrimination. It's discriminating against somebody on the basis of their religious beliefs, and that's illegal under the US Constitution.
Yep, the government decided to settle the matter and allow the research rather than deal with the hassle that comes anytime Christians are denied anything. Even things they absolutely should not be granted, like full access to vandalized national parks, or exemptions from basic public safety rules. Because far from being the most oppressed group in the former United States, Christians are so privileged that they got to destroy that country, and most people didn't even notice. Because when Christians get what they want but do not deserve, that's basically just routine. Unless, of course, you're the wrong kind of Christian. Like Christians in historically black denominations. Or Christians whose homelands are in the areas that the United States decided to just blow the fuck up.
Okay, so he got some samples after legal action.
After 4 years after he initially applied, in 2017, he took the samples.
It's a long time to wait. And what did he find? Did he was able to do some of the tests, and what was the evidence?
The evidence was that the fold is full of microfractures, wear on grains at microfracture sites, the strata thickness varied on it minutely, and there was no significant mixing of the strata at the boundaries between them. Then Snelling just lied and said that all of that was evidence that the strata were soft when folded. I mean, obviously, there's more to it than that, but that's the gist of it. One group of people who have no more than the expected number of microfractures are my patrons on Patreon. YouTube earnings fluctuate wildly, and it's not always easy to predict what they'll be. As of writing this, the only reason I know that I'll be in the black next month is because of Patreon. If you value what I do and you want to keep me doing it, and importantly, can afford it, then please consider joining my Patreon. It starts at only $1 a month, you can get a 15% discount if you join with an annual subscription, and you get early access to videos like this, often more than 5 months in advance. You can get access to my super secret Discord server, and at higher tiers, there's even more perks. So help a dino out. If you can.
Yeah, well, I think the Parks Authority people realised that if you did the research, it would probably not be in favour of their view about how long everything took to form.
Hey, this is for everyone who ever told me that young Earth creationism isn't a conspiracy theory. Y'all can go f*** yourselves. Batten just made up a conspiracy theory to hide the age of the Earth on the part of the National Park Service.
And that's what he found.
It's really not, though.
It's a major research project where he looked at the samples under a geological microscope, where you can look at things like, were the sand grains distorted? And was there any metamorphosis, in other words, changing of sandstone into quartzite or anything like that?
And there was not, further emphasizing that this formation had to form through steady folding over millions of years after all the rock had been deposited and lithified. I can't stress this enough. Snelling found conclusive evidence that debunked his entire view of Earth's prehistoric past, and just said, yeah, but that just proves I'm right anyway.
And lots of other checks as well, but everything that he looked at said this stuff was soft when it was bent.
By everything, he means literally nothing. And look, geologists recognize that some bending occurs when the rock isn't rock yet, and it's still soft. So it's not like this is a phenomenon that no one knows how to recognize. It has very well described and not very easy to miss characteristics. The problem is that Snelling, and by virtue of just being his meat puppet, Don here, has excluded an explanation. You see, a layer can bend quickly when soft, quickly when hard, or slowly when hard. You might wonder about slowly when soft, and the problem there is that the process of lithification is such that the rock will likely harden before much slow bending can occur, and it would also be hard to distinguish from the more likely fast bending. The rock is not compatible with either of the explanations that Snelling finds acceptable, so he has to stuff all the evidence into the only two boxes that his dogma will allow. He chose fast and soft, possibly because it's easier to lie about the fractures, often microscopic ones, than it is to lie about metamorphism, since the rock clearly isn't metamorphic, and no one has ever really called it metamorphic. What has actually happened is that Snelling studied rocks that completely disprove his dogma, but since his dogma is definitionally not open to change on the basis of evidence, he doesn't care.
Wow.
What do you mean, wow? A known liar went and vandalized a national park, then lied about his findings, all in service to a conclusion he already reached despite the evidence. Which we know because he'd already been lying about this kind of thing for years. The only wild thing is that this was allowed to happen in the first place, which it never should have been.
So they kind of knew that this might not be a favorable move for their beliefs of how it was created.
No, they knew it wouldn't matter, and it didn't. Andrew Snelling is a known entity. He's a well-known liar, and no steward of any natural landscape should let him collect anything, because he'll just destroy a part of that landscape in an effort to lie, and on top of that, he publishes his lies in a pretend journal that he himself edits. Yeah, you heard that right. His so-called peer-reviewed papers are primarily published in his own publication. That means it's impossible for there to be peer review, because on the one hand, he has final say over whether papers are published regardless of the reviewer responses. And further, anyone who would recommend against publishing his papers would themselves risk his ire, and so risk being barred from publishing. And in the world of faux journals that cater to young Earth creationists, it's not like there are a whole plethora of options. Andrew Snelling is the kind of guy who, if he tells you that the sky is blue, you might want to go check.
It sort of looks like they didn't want the research done because they suspected it might not be in favour of their millions of years story.
Does it look like that? Not from where I'm sitting, because as it turns out, nothing he found was a problem for science, and what it actually was a problem for flood geology. But of course, Andy there lied about that. But hey, why not just fly into paranoid conspiracy theories the moment someone bars you from vandalizing a national park so you can lie for Jesus?
And so what does that actually mean for the millions of years stories then?
Nothing, because if Snelling were right, it would just mean that rocks fold before lithification more often than we thought. That's it. It wouldn't change the rate of lithification, it wouldn't do a damn thing to radiometric dating, ice core dating, dendrochronology, electron resonance spin dating, sedimentation rates, racemization dating, etc. All of which indicate that the world is many times older than even the oldest estimate given by young Earth creationists.
Well, that fold represents 480 million years of evolutionary time. In other words, the time between the bottom layer being laid down and the top layer being laid down is between the bottom layer laid down and the folding, 480 million years.
Right.
I'm not going to check into numbers on that because I can't imagine how they'd matter.
And if
that was all soft when it was bent, it eliminates nearly 500 million years of evolutionary time.
So again, we're losing millions of years.
We're losing substantial slabs of deep time.
Maybe if Snelling weren't lying about this, but he is, so we haven't lost a single year of deep time.
In fact, if you think about the Phanerozoic, which is the fossil-bearing strata.
Nope, there are pre-Phanerozoic fossils. The Ediacaran period is before the Phanerozoic. The Phanerozoic starts with the Cambrian and runs until today, but we have older fossils.
It's a section of the geologic column that has fossils, a lot of fossils in it, Phanerozoic. supposed to be 541 million years, according to radiometric dating.
Yes, okay.
And this research wipes out 90% of that time.
Probably what motivated Snelling to lie about it in the first place. But also, does it? Because it seems to me like, at best, even if Snelling were right, it would only wipe out some of the time. Because it would mean that the deposition and folding were rapid, but also could have occurred a very long time ago, into deep time.
So that might have had to have been created pretty soon and pretty quickly as well.
I don't know what that he's referring to.
Well, it indicates that it was laid down very quickly and bent before it could become hard. So it was laid down very quickly and bent before it could become hard, which compresses all that time into a very short time.
Aw, man. I was hoping he'd repeat himself a third time. You know, for the comedic rule of 3. Also, what's with you humans loving prime numbers? You know they have the fewest possible factors, right? I want more factors. Factors are great. Think about how many ways you can divide 7 of something into whole numbers. It's 2. Just 2 ways. But 6 of something, you can divide evenly by 1, 2, 3, and 6. That's 4 ways. But you go for 12, and now you're at 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12. That's 6 whole factors. That's why dozens are so cool. And even though you've mostly gone with the vastly inferior decimal system, you still often buy things by the dozen or even great dozen or gross. All of that is base 12.
People are very strange these days.
It's consistent with the material being laid down during Noah's flood very quickly over the year of the flood.
The Carbon Canyon Fold is part of the Tonto group of the Grand Canyon, and specifically, it is primarily composed of sandstone, the Tapete sandstone. There is only one thing you need to know about the Tapete sandstone to know that it was not a flood deposit. It has fossilized burrows. Flood deposits destroy such traces, and yet, there they are. Further, it has cross-bedding consistent with shallow marine deposition as well as intertidal deposition. It was a beach and a seafloor near the beach. Nothing about it, aside from the occasional conglomeration of larger stones, could even vaguely be interpreted as indicating a flood deposition. Above this is shale, the Bright Angel shale, which cannot deposit without flocculation in a flood, and guess what? No one has ever reported finding floccules in the Bright Angel shale. Although I'm expecting that any day now, Snelling or one of his stooges that he calls students will go and further vandalize the Grand Canyon in an effort to lie about that too. Every single last thing we know about the Tonto group, including the characteristic of folded rocks in it, absolutely precludes or fails to support a global flood ever having occurred. Never mind being the cause of the formation's deposition in the first place.
And then the bending occurred near the end of the flood or soon after the flood with the tectonic forces and things which were operating on the Earth at the time.
Except that would result in uneven thickness in the strata, mixing at the margins of the strata, a relative lack of grain abrasion, and the absence of both large-scale brittle fractures as well as microscopic fractures associated with the deformation of solid rock. The fold in question is the opposite of all that. So let's talk about sedimentary rocks. If you think back to your earth science class in school, you probably learned about the 3 main types of rock. Igneous, formed by volcanic action, metamorphic, formed from the transformation of other rocks by heat and pressure, and sedimentary, formed by the deposition and later hardening of small grains from other rocks, and the rocks in which we normally find fossils, as well as the rocks that we're talking about right now. We are going to use sandstone as our example for this. Sandstone is made of sand grains, which are particles normally of silicate minerals that are between 0.06 millimeters and 2 millimeters in diameter. Sand is the result of the weathering of rocks, and is typically transported by wind, water, or both. Once it has been deposited, dissolved chemicals such as calcite, quartz, silica, and others build up and lock the grains in place in a process called lithification. When a layer of sand is under differential pressure which will cause it to fold, different things will happen depending on whether and how much it has lithified. Let's start with the easy case. The sand is not bound by a cementing agent, and so the grains can easily move relative to each other and any confining rocks. In this case, the sand will move away from areas of high pressure into areas of low pressure, just like you can see if you were to squeeze a balloon in a few different areas. Also, there will be few, if any, instances where the sand grains chip each other, since they're free to move. And there will be few, if any, fractures, since the whole of the sand deposit is not brittle at this point on scales larger than individual grains. This is not exactly rocket science. You can see what I mean if you just fill a plastic bag with wet sand and push it around. Squeeze a couple parts and push them in different directions. You'll see what I mean about no fractures and different thicknesses of the sand deposit. Really, next time you're at a sandy beach, bring a plastic shopping bag or something, fill it with wet but not dripping sand, and manipulate it. Just make sure you don't leave the bag behind, since it's a hazard to wildlife in the area, especially if you live in a place with sea turtles who feed on sea jellies, and may mistake the bag for prey. So let's look at the other scenario, where the sand is bound together by crystals of some substance, perhaps calcite, which locks the grains in place relative to each other. Well, rock is famously strong under compression, which is why it's such a great building material. So the first thing to note is that the lithified sandstone under pressure will not be able to flow away from areas of greater pressure to lower pressure like a still soft sandy mix would be able to. As a result, the pressure causes cracks, mostly small ones, but sometimes large ones, and each one allows the rock to shift a bit to relieve that pressure. At a microscopic scale, these microfractures cause grains at the boundaries of the rocks to move past each other, causing extra wear on the grains themselves. These fractures will be all over the rock, as will the additional grain abrasion. Now, lithification isn't a binary state, and the degree to which a deposit of sand or other sediment will fit neatly into one of the above categories will vary on a spectrum. But what that means is that it's not beyond science to figure out the degree of lithification a stratum had experienced before it folded.
Right.
Whenever he says anything, you say, right, Brett. You know that?
Right.
And so this sort of research that's done, it's genuine research.
I struggle to imagine a way in which research could be less genuine than this.
How was that received by the mainstream sort of research and science community?
It mostly wasn't, because it wasn't really published anywhere where real scientists would likely even notice it, unless they're weirdos, like us and the science friends, who have been following this nonsense as a special interest of ours. For everyone else, this was basically a fart in a hurricane. It means nothing other than that grifting pseudoscientists continue to grift. I mean, that ark won't build itself, nor will the Tower of Babel recreation, and while Snelling's work doesn't directly bring in money, what it does do is provide a thin veneer of apparent intellectual rigor and academic value to Answers in Genesis. And that they can use to bolster their begging for money from other Christians, notably including Christian nationalist neo-fascists, whom they have also hosted at the Ark Encounter for a conference. So yeah, Andrew Snelling vandalizing national parks is ultimately part of an openly stated agenda to take over what's left of the United States in an effort to enshrine white supremacy, theocracy, and the erasure of LGBTQ+ people. So not only is he a liar, he is in fact part of the machine that's trying to kill you if you're watching this and you're anything other than a cis-het white Christian male. But only the right kind of Christian, mind you. If you're Orthodox or Catholic, you're only going to be tolerated until they no longer need you. Then you'll be dumped in with all the Muslims they fearmonger about.
Well, the fact he was refused permission to do the research shows you it's not popular.
No.
It's not popular.
Yeah, vandalism of national parks is generally frowned upon, and as someone who likes national parks, I can see why.
But the deep time idea is so entrenched that people just, they shake their eye with this, must be some explanation.
Yeah.
A couple things. One, the deep time idea is entrenched for the same reason gravity is entrenched in physics. It's called overwhelming evidence and no viable alternative. Second, there's nothing to explain because Snelling lied. I don't have to explain why I still believe in gravity after someone decided to use obvious VFX to fake a levitating rock. I just don't have to point out that it's fake. It's the same thing here. Everything that Snelling concluded about the fold in question in no way supports his conclusion, and he knows that, and he's lied before, and I have to believe that unless he dies before this video comes out, he'll lie again.
Yeah.
There must be some explanation, but there isn't.
There is. The explanation is that nothing that Snelling reported in any way challenges anything in the consensus view of either that fold or rock folding in general. In fact, he found excellent evidence against his own position, and then just pretended it was actually evidence for his position. It's a textbook case of pseudoscientific reasoning, and I put reasoning here in about as many scare quotes as I possibly can.
There isn't an explanation.
That is, again, a very interesting topic to dive into, and there's no real answer we've got so far from other scientists.
Well, it completely contradicts their expectations, which is a seriously failed prediction.
Seriously failed prediction.
I'd love one specific thing that was a prediction that failed. Because let's remember, the prediction that he said failed is that there should be metamorphic transformation in rocks that folded while lithified. Except that that's not a prediction. That's a straw man. So I guess congrats on defeating a straw man that no geologist has supported as near as I can tell. But just like if I said that Christianity is wrong because Jesus coming back as a zombie would have started a zombie plague, and it didn't, it's the kind of thing I'd expect Christians to reject without even thinking about it. That's what scientists do with this kind of dishonest nonsense.
Well, we're on a roll here. We've got 3 failed predictions down.
All of which were less failed predictions of science, and more failed predictions of a straw man version of science that Don here made up himself. Or that was made up for him by other charlatans, like Andrew Snelling. So we're on a roll, but it's a roll of abject failure.
Up to number 4, you mentioned a word, bioturbation.
Oh hey, that's the thing that the Tapete sandstone is full of that shows that it categorically was not a flood deposit. I bet he'll lie about this too. But you know who would never lie about the Tapete sandstone? That's right, my channel members. The join button is right below this video, and the memberships start at just $1.99 a month. Joining gives you access to some members-only videos, early access to all my scripted videos like this, as well as membership in my supporters-only Discord. You also get a green name and channel badge in chat, as well as access to my channel emojis, all of which can be used during live streams or during premieres.
What is bioturbation?
Yeah, that's a mouthful, but it's basically the stirring up that occurs with creatures that live on the seafloor or on the lake floor.
Or the forest floor, or the desert floor, or whatever. But I forgot that creationists pretend that non-aqueous sedimentary rock doesn't exist. Oops.
Things like pippies. I have a fossil of one here.
Is Pippi like Australian for clam? If you're Australian, and I know I have Australian viewers, please let me know what that word means in America speak, because I'm not up on all the down under vocab.
So this is a fossil of a bivalve. It tells its own story, but we won't go there. But these things, if you've been fishing, I believe.
I've been fishing a couple of times. I'm not an avid fisher, but I've done it.
I too have gone fishing a few times. I'm not particularly good at it, but I've done it.
But you've done the thing on the beach with your toes and you dig into the sand and get these pippies out?
I've dug for clams with a shovel. Does that count?
Not with my toes, but yeah, we've got some pippies along the way.
Well, you can do them with your toes. You get there and you wiggle your toes into the thing and you can feel them with your toes.
For fuck's sake, Don, no one cares about your foot fetish. What the hell is your point?
So these things, if you don't grab them quickly, they burrow back into the sand really quickly.
Yeah.
Right. So what happens with the tides and everything, they come up out of the sand to feed and they go back into the sand. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of other creatures like this that stir up the sand.
That's true.
There's worms and all sorts of shellfish and things that stir up the sand. And these things have been in the fossil record all the way back to the bottom of the so-called Phanerozoic, which is all the fossil-bearing strata.
Nope, bivalves do not go all the way back to the beginning of the Cambrian. They don't show up for tens of millions of years, and they are preceded by obvious transitional forms like Halkieria, which has clam-like shells on either end of its body. Worms show up before the Cambrian and are themselves preceded by what seem like stem bilaterians, things like Dickinsonia, which are almost, but not quite, bilaterally symmetrical. Don wants you to believe the lie that all these forms arise in the Cambrian all of a sudden without any plausible evolutionary transitions. But that's not true.
So if you're laying down sediment, sand, silt, and mud depositing on a seafloor or a lake floor, these creatures are stirring it up all the time.
Yeah, which is why much of sedimentary rock from the Phanerozoic contains bioturbation, including the Tapete sandstone, of the previous so-called failed prediction.
Right. And
now the prediction is...
I was actually about to ask that. What is the prediction here then? We know what bioturbation is, and we know they're busy disturbing sediment on the seafloor. What does that actually mean? What is the prediction here?
The thing is that if the sediments were laid down over the time frame they claim...
Which they were.
There's such a small amount of sediment each year that it would all be stirred up.
No, the prediction is not that it would all be stirred up. You can go to a modern location where sediment is depositing where organisms live and notice that it's not all stirred up. Look, here's a clip of someone looking at sand being deposited with bands of different color sediment in the modern day. You can tell it's modern day because if it wasn't, then how the f*** would there be footage of it?
See this black sand seam? It was created when this river flooded last night. I guarantee you there is going to be a lot of gold sitting in with this heavy black sand. I'm going to drop a quick test in it and show you guys the result.
See that? There's structures in there. Now, for a group that likes to whine eternally about uniformitarian assumptions, you'd think that they would recognize that according to uniformitarianism, if not all sediment has all structure erased by bioturbation today, That would also be the case in the past, and so the actual prediction would be that we find bioturbation all over the geological record, but not everywhere in the geological record. Once again, this prediction is just a straw man.
Right.
So there'd be no structure in the rock.
At all. So it would all be stirred up by these pippies and whatnot, coming up for feeding, going down, stirring up all the sediment, and that wouldn't actually have nice formations of rock.
No nice. Everybody's seen through road cuttings and things like that. You see the layers in the rock and that sort of thing.
Yeah, things that we still see happening today. While life is basically everywhere on Earth, even deep underground, big organisms that can actually disturb things like varves, cross-bedding, and such internal structures are not everywhere. But bioturbation is found all over the place in the fossil record, including the stratum we already spent the first part of this video talking about. Yet bioturbation can be observed all the way back to the Cambrian and even just before. So far from a failed prediction of science, this is a failed prediction of flood geology, like all predictions of flood geology. Also, why do I feel like this too is going to depend on some bullshit that Andrew's motherfucker never told the truth Snelling made up? I hope not, but I don't know. I respond to these as I go.
And a lot of them are horizontal, sometimes bent, but you see the layers in the rock. And the layers wouldn't be there, they'd be all stirred up.
Wrong, 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 wrong.
In fact, experiments have been done with these creatures, and within an hour or so, they stir up a depth of 100 millimetres, 10 centimetres, 4 inches, within an hour or so, is stirred up.
Well, we're back to the old tactic that Batten loves of just claiming that something has been done in science that may support him without telling us what we need to know to actually find the source on this and see who did this, with what organisms, what substrate, what their findings were, etc. Instead, the guy who just spouted a bunch of obvious lies from one of the most obvious liars in all of creationism is just asking us to trust him, bro. Well, in point of fact, I do not trust him. I can't imagine a world in which I'd trust a creationist PhD on anything. Further, let's just take this report at face value. So they determined a rate at which animals on average burrow into sediment. But animals don't just keep digging. Batten himself, when he was talking about what I still presume are clams, pointed out that they burrow up to feed. They have to stay close enough to the surface to get oxygen and food, so they bury themselves enough to be relatively safe from predators, but not so deep that they suffocate or starve. Which means that if animals that cause bioturbation colonize a location, they're not going to remove all the structure underlying them, even if it is unlithified. And again, we can see this both today and in the stones we've been talking about, because remember that the peat sandstone that Snelling is so in love with when he vandalized it has both bioturbation and obvious crossbedding. And just as a further reminder, the presence of bioturbation and ichnofossils at all preclude a flood as an explanation.
Right. And how much sediment is expected with the old sort of idea? How much sediment has to be laid there and stay there?
What is he even asking? If you're watching this after the premiere, pause. Let me know what you think he's asking in the comments, but I'll be damned if I know.
Well, if you divide the thickness of the Phanerozoic, which is about 2 kilometres, that's the fossil-bearing strata.
Jesus Christ, if he decides that he's just going to divide the thickness that he just made up by the duration of the Phanerozoic to present, and then use an average deposition rate derived from that to calculate the length of time it took for some stratum to deposit, based on its individual thickness, I'm going to lose my goddamn mind.
Yeah.
And they say it's 541 million years. Get your calculator out.
He's going to do it, isn't he? God damn it, I hate this so much. You know, this video was actually a request from my comments. If you requested this, I hope you did it because you wanted me to suffer. Because boy, am I suffering now.
Divide 2 kilometres by 541 million years.
Okay.
The answer is 0.004 millimetres per year of sediment.
That has to be laid and undisturbed.
Audience, I'm going to talk to Donnie here, just in case he ever watches this, and if I'm being honest, so I can use second-person pronouns, because for this bit, I kind of have to. If this isn't your kind of thing and your name isn't Don Batten, feel free to skip to this timestamp when I'll have gone back to addressing the rest of you, rather than this sack of shit. Okay, Donnie, listen up, you mendacious skid mark. What you just did might be one of the stupidest things I have ever seen outside of a Roger Spur or Matt Nyler video. And if you know who the hell those are, you know how dumb this is. You just divided the total depth of the Phanerozoic, which isn't even something that you can just calculate, because there is no one depth for it, it varies, and you divided it by the number of years it has existed to get a sedimentation rate. Let's look at why that's so dumb. I wonder how you managed to take a piss in the morning without falling into the toilet and drowning. First of all, in order to take unconsolidated sediment and turn it into rock, the overall process has two basic parts: compaction and cementation. Compaction is kind of like what happened to you when your shit got so hard and unable to pass that it filled up your whole digestive system and then backed into your brain, explaining why everything you say is so full of shit and why you're such a shit for brains moron. As you might be able to tell from the word itself, if you knew any Latin, compaction is the process by which pressure causes the grains in a sedimentary deposit to go closer together. This reduces the overall thickness of the sedimentary layer by an order of magnitude or even more in most cases. So already you can't simply do this math, even if you could come up with a meaningful estimate for how thick the Phanerozoic is. Next, this requires that there have been no period of net erosion, which I suspect is only possible because you think that weathering erosion don't happen. Probably because someone eroded your brain with sandpaper. In fact, we know that most of the sediment from the Phanerozoic is gone. So there's a second reason that your math is dumb. Third, we can just measure sedimentation rates. They're not 0.004 millimeters per year in most places. In most places, they're much higher or they're negative. So no one thinks that there was a sustained 0.004 millimeter per year deposition rate for about 600 million years. Each stratum, hell, each lamina, will have its own deposition rate, which may be higher or lower than 0.004. Fourth, for this to make sense, even if the previous points weren't true, it would have to be the case that macroscopic animals always colonize every sedimentary environment as soon as it forms without giving it time to accumulate sediment free of bioturbation. You, of all people, should know that that isn't how that works, given that apparently your neurons didn't have time to colonize the whole of your goddamn brain case. Don, if you watch this, I want you to comment on this video or email me at the.dapper.dino.yt@gmail.com and tell me, are you just stupid or are you lying? Because it's getting harder and harder to think that these absolutely brain-dead takes are just a result of you being ignorant. Hell, if you're not, Don, let me know what you think in the comments, because I think we're getting to the inevitable point in any video about creationists PhDs where I come to the unavoidable conclusion that they're just liars.
Well, and it's a tenth the thickness of a sheet of paper per year.
Which you would think might be a clue that that's a dumb take, and probably that the math that went into the estimate is wrong in some way. This is one of the most basic things you can do in science or engineering after you've done some math. You look at that math and check if it even makes a lick of sense. If it doesn't, then either you've done the math wrong or your assumptions are wrong. Don apparently never learned about this, or more likely decided to ignore it. Because at this point, are we really going to keep pretending that there's a snowball's chance in Phoenix that he's doing this in good faith?
And we can already see that these pippies and whatnot are already stirring up more than that in an hour.
That's correct. They're stirring up much more than that in an hour.
Which again, combined with the fact that we have current sediment that has not had its structure destroyed by bioturbation, shows that this estimate is stupid. Combine that with the fact that we have sediments in the fossil record with both preserved structure and bioturbation, the latter of which would have been destroyed by a flood, mind you, and you can start to see why not only is this not a failed prediction, it's more of a reason to think that Don Batten is either so stupid he wouldn't realize he poured mayonnaise on his breakfast cereal instead of milk, or he's just a f***ing liar. Again, you tell me which it is, although I think you can tell which way I'm leaning today.
So in other words, to get structure in the rock, there must be much more than 100 millimeters per hour deposited to actually not get the stirring up.
No, because yet again, animals do not always colonize sediment immediately, and they do not just dig around continuously in the substrate. They stop, which again, you can just see by going outside and digging a bit. You, sitting there on the toilet or folding your clothes or using this as background noise while you game. Yes, you, Brenda. I'm talking to you specifically. Go outside and look for some loose sediment. Dig into it. See if it has bioturbation all the way down. I bet it won't. So why should we expect that if that sediment lithifies in the future, that all that structure will go away. We shouldn't, because it won't.
Right, and we don't see that at all.
No. In fact, two scientists, Dr. Leonard Brand and Dr. Art Chadwick in the United States.
Those aren't scientists. They're more vandals who have the advantage of having a wrongfully accredited creationist cult-backed school, Loma Linda University, behind them. In case you're wondering which cult, it's the Seventh-day Adventists. You know, the ones who, at least in some instances, think that CERN was created by Satan to build a bomb to nuke God in heaven. Because that's a thing they think is possible, I guess. Yeah, that's who we're trusting now. Or at least who Batten wants us to trust.
Did a major study of this, and they looked at the rock layers between the Cambrian and the Eocene. That's sort of basically the whole thing in Utah and Arizona in the United States, which has been well studied rock-wise. You know, there's been a lot of study done by all sorts of geologists on this.
Yep, and you know what all those other studies have in common? They didn't seem to notice any particular lack of expected bioturbation. But of course, if you just lie about how much bioturbation there should be by vastly overestimating it, then suddenly it's really easy to say that there isn't enough. Just like it's really easy to lie to yourself about how much pizza you should eat, and then eat too much of it. I don't know, that was probably a bad analogy, but I'm pissed and I kind of wish I had pizza. I like pizza. It makes me happy when times are sad. You'll never know, dear, how much I love pizza. Oh, please don't take my pizza away.
Mm-hmm.
And they looked at they graded the bioturbation at a scale of 1 to 5.
Pro tip, if you want your lies about science to seem more plausible, add more numbers.
And they graded the bioturbation, no bioturbation through to heavily bioturbated, in other words, all stirred up and no structure, versus, no stirring.
Mm-hmm.
And let's remember that since floods characteristically erase bioturbation, there should have been no bioturbation at all.
And almost all of it was unstirred. There's just very little that's actually stirred up.
But some of it was, so it wasn't a flood then. Cool. Thanks to Chadwick and Powell for confirming that Noah's flood didn't cause any of the Phanerozoic rocks in the Midwest of the former United States.
So what would have to happen for this to actually be the case, for what we see to have an explanation if these pippies and things are stirring it all up?
Nothing would have to happen. Just like the previous two so-called failed predictions that weren't predictions at all. Just straw men. There's nothing that needs explaining here. The level of bioturbation is both perfectly in line with what we see today and what we'd expect to see in the past, and completely incompatible with a young Earth and flood geology. Do you think that Don knows that he's allowed to target things other than his own foot when he goes shooting? It doesn't seem like it.
Well, there's no explanation other than the fact that time is fictional.
Yep, you heard him. He just said that time is fictional. Well, I guess that means it's time for...
Time exists.
Thanks, Jesh.
Right.
The amount of time is fictional. So the go-to is, there's been a period of rapid sedimentation, and that's where we get the structure.
Yeah.
And then there's periods where there's nothing happening.
Wow. You mean like what happens all over the place on Earth? What a crazy supposition. What's next? Will they presume that gravity existed in the past? Or maybe that electrons did? What will these goofy evolutionists come up with next? I mean, continuity in natural processes? How silly of them. We all know that in the past, things just happened, randomly, for no reason, with no explanation. Then today happened, and suddenly reality settled down, also for no reason. That's why there's no point in investigating past events, because really, is the past even real? I mean, we've already heard that time is fictional, so who cares, right? There was no past, and there will be no future. There is only the eternal now. So subscribe to my Patreon for infinite money over no duration, because everything is made up anyway. Also, if you actually could look into my Patreon, it would help a lot. This is a very volatile job, and the extra stability would help me to be more able to budget and plan, and maybe even be able to spend more on video production. Thanks.
And that's where the time is, you see. It's in the gaps. That's the idea.
Okay.
Yeah, because that's how time and erosion work. Saying it like you're whispering gossip to your high school girlfriends doesn't change that if sediment is not on net deposited or on net eroded, then time won't be represented by later rocks. That's just how basic logic works. Events follow one after the other in an order. Erosion is an event. It takes time. If it happens, then you won't have that event present and represented by rock. Welcome to reality. Enjoy your stay. It increasingly sucks here. And for the most part, that's because of people like Don Batten. So that's fun.
So that was a popular idea, but this study showed that there's actually no gaps, because
No, it didn't.
if you had gaps in time, you'd have bioturbation. You'd have no structure.
Unless the bioturbation is one of the things that fucking eroded away. And also, regardless of erosion, you wouldn't have any in a flood, and yet we do. Can you tell that Don is pissing me off? Is that coming through? Because if it's not, then I want you to know that he is. And really, he should be doing that to you too. Anyone getting science and just basic how time works this wrong should be an insult to you as a fellow thinking being.
But there's structure almost all the way through it, so there's no gaps.
Non sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.
There's no periods of quiescence, no periods of long time where hardly anything's happening.
Right, and so does that mean there had to be rapid time, like this would have to have occurred rapidly?
No, it physically couldn't have in most cases. But hey, let's hear whatever lie Donnie is going to tell about it.
The whole lot has to be deposited really rapidly in quick time, otherwise you'd have it all stirred up.
Oh, right, okay.
I don't know if you can tell, but this is getting so exhausting, and I've already covered it in so much detail that I'm losing the will to even speak, and I'm regressing into memes.
It's like, again, Noah's flood explains the formation of these layers in quick time.
No, it doesn't. Not only is a flood physically incapable of producing most of the structure that Don is so keen to point out hasn't been erased by bioturbation, but it also would preclude what bioturbation we do have. So that's a double preclusion of the flood. And no, a few cultists with petrology hammers haven't changed that.
And, by the way, the pipi, or the bivalve here, when it's fossilized, is intact.
Yeah.
When you find these shells on the beach, you just find half of it.
Yeah.
Because when they die, the little muscle inside that holds it together, it falls apart.
Okay.
I have talked about this more times than there are grains of sand on the beach or stars in the sky. I'm skipping it. We all know that most fossils are formed in rapid deposition. That's not the same as Noah's flood, even if it was a flood. There being a flood somewhere at some time does not mean that there was a flood everywhere at the same time. You can tell because floods happen today, and most people aren't in the flood, even though some people are. Oh, but I guess that assumes that events actually occur in time, which I guess maybe I shouldn't. Oh, and also clams live buried down, so if they die while burrowed, they can't open their shells.
So the bioturbation study, it really eliminates this huge amount of time.
Well, only in the sense that lies are truth, war is peace, and slavery is freedom.
It says that the time frame that they've given for all this sedimentation is just wrong by many orders of magnitude. I mean, like 100 million times wrong.
Wow, how convenient. A paper that says, no, we're not wrong by 8 orders of magnitude. You are. This paper might as well have just said, I know you are, but what am I, over and over for 3 pages for all the good it did the creationist cause.
Right. Okay.
That sort of order of magnitude, because
it's conveniently the number of orders of magnitude that young Earth creationism is wrong by. And so to be right, they have to find out that you isn't just a petulant whine, it's actually true.
From 0.004 millimeters per year.
Which is an estimate so stupid it's hard to see how anyone could use it who isn't lying. Seriously, it's like measuring the distance from where someone was born to where they died, then dividing that by how long they lived, and assuming that that's how fast they walked. In fact, let's do it. Duane Gish of Gish Gallop fame was born in White City, Kansas, and he died in San Diego, California. That's 1,218 miles. I'm using miles since he was un-American, and Americans would rather die than use the metric system. He was born on February 17, 1921, and died on March 5, 2013. That's 33,620 days. Of course, this means that he spent his entire life walking at the blistering pace of 15 inches per minute from the place he was born to where he died. I mean, that must be what happened, right? That's the distance from where he started to where he ended, and that's how long it took him to start and end. So of course that's what his whole life was. Yeah, if you can see why that's stupid, then you're smarter than Don Batten.
1/10 the thickness of a sheet of paper, you're not going to get fossils, you're going to get complete bioturbation. It doesn't figure. The millions and billions of years story does not make sense of the physical evidence.
Just like all these stories about Duane Gish going around the world doing debates, driving in cars, flying in airplanes, riding on trains or boats, those don't make sense. When we all know he spent his whole life shambling at an incredibly slow pace from Kansas to California, without ever stopping to sleep, eat, piss, take a shit, or anything else. I guess the Institute for Creation Research is actually a bunch of liars when they talk about the life of their founder.
It's another major fail for the evolutionary predictions.
Yeah, a claim that could be refuted by your average 5-year-old sure isn't a problem for science.
And with that, there's no get-out-of-jail-free card here. Like, we had some other sort of answers with the previous predictions where, there was contamination or something like that, where you had to do some refuting. But is there any sort of get-out-of-jail-free card here?
No, because there's no jail here. You don't need a get-out-of-jail-free card when the jail doesn't exist.
Well, the only one is one we mentioned, which is the idea that there's been a period of rapid sedimentation, and then there's periods of nothing happening.
Wow, you mean the solution to the problem of Duane Gish being reported as having done debates all over the place, even though we showed that he was just walking slowly across the western half of North America, is that maybe he did go do those debates and just ended up in California eventually, where he died, not having spent his entire life on a straight line between White City, Kansas and San Diego, California? I don't know. Seems pretty far-fetched to me.
But
it doesn't work.
That's right. ICR are dirty liars. Duane Gish stayed on that straight and narrow path from the moment of his birth until he dropped 93 years later, or whatever.
Because this study shows that there's never been a period of nothing happening.
Well, yeah, I guess there has never been a time of nothing happening. Because erosion is something which we know has happened.
Exactly.
Almost no periods of nothing happening.
Way to walk it back, Donnie. Man, Batten, Badinsky, Trump, what is it with Donalds?
We're going to hit the final point here. We got up to number 5, failed prediction number 5.
I would argue that at best this is failed prediction number 1.
You mentioned convergent evolution. Can you explain what that actually is?
I'm not sure he can, but let's hear him try anyway.
So convergent evolution is where you find creatures with similar features that could not have a common ancestor, which explains the common features.
Well, that's a sloppy way to put it. Convergence is an aspect of evolution where, because physics is everywhere the same, different organisms will find similar solutions to adapt to the same or similar environmental pressures, resulting in superficially similar features that are not derived from a common ancestor with such a feature. For example, birds, bats, and pterosaurs all have superficially similar wings, although structurally they are quite distinct. They evolved these similar wings because the physics of flight are what they are, but the common ancestor of all of them did not have wings at all. The difference in structure is important here. Convergence is usually only skin deep, and convergent features often have vastly different underlying genetics and/or anatomy, although in relatively closely related species, it can be harder to detect. Also, this is just something we observe happening, so I'm not sure how it's a failed prediction.
So, for example, you have red hair, and one of your parents has probably got red hair.
That's true, my mum does.
That's right, your mum's got red hair. So you have a common ancestor. You have an ancestor. So you might have a brother or sister with red hair, and the reason you both have red hair is because you've got a common ancestor, your mother, who's got red hair, which passed it on to you.
This isn't particularly important, but you don't need to have a parent with red hair to have red hair. Red hair is a recessive trait, with brown and black hair being dominant. So you could have parents with brown or black hair but who have the red hair allele. In that case, 25% of their offspring will have red hair and 75% will have brown or black hair. If one parent has red hair and the other is heterozygous for red hair, then 50% of their offspring will have red hair. If one parent has red hair but the other does not carry the red hair allele, then none of the offspring will have red hair. And finally, if both parents have red hair, then all their children will too. Hooray for Mendelian genetics.
This is a case where creatures have similarities which can't have a common ancestor.
I hate how he's phrasing this. Similarities don't have ancestors. Organisms do. This is a case where creatures have similarities that were not shared by those organisms' most recent common ancestor. That's how you phrase this to be correct. And also to sound like you know what you're talking about.
Right.
So, for example, with marsupial animals and placental animals. So your placental animals are things like dogs and cats and cows and us.
Yeah.
I always find it interesting that creationists will accept everything we know about human taxonomy until usually the order level. They don't want to think of themselves as primates. Also, paradoxically, some of them will also accept that they are vertebrates and mammals and placental mammals, but then reject that they're animals, as if all of those were not categories within the animal kingdom. It's almost like they're basing all of their taxonomic thinking on emotion, rather than evidence and rigorous definitions.
But the marsupial animals are things like kangaroos and wombats. But your marsupials have a pouch, basically.
Yeah.
Opossums in America, possums in Australia, tree kangaroos.
That was a lot of examples when he could have just mentioned the pouch. He also could have mentioned the epipubic bone, which marsupials have and placental mammals lack, or that marsupials have a split uterus rather than a single-chambered uterus as typical in placental mammals. But I guess, what can you expect from a botanist?
But the really interesting thing is that there are all sorts of versions of marsupials, which there are very, very similar placental mammals.
Yeah, which is a problem for creationism. Not only does evolution have a simple explanation for this, but it just creates two huge questions for creationism. The first, of course, is why did God create so many superficially similar organisms that have the same niche? If God created canids, why did he also bother with thylacines? If the answer is just that he liked diversity, then why aren't there even more diverse options for the canid niche? Also, how is it that marsupials are so reliably segregated to Australia and its surrounding islands, with the sole exception of the opossums of the New World? They all got off the ark, so what was so special about marsupials in Australia that kept the marsupials out of virtually every location on Earth but Australia, and kept virtually all placental mammals out of Australia? Creationism has no explanation for this, but evolution and geology do. Marsupials evolved when South America, Antarctica, and Australia were all one big continent, and marsupials evolved on that continent, while placentals evolved in the north, where Eurasia, Africa, and North America combined into what was variously a single landmass, or a few landmasses with only narrow channels between them. The marsupial population of Antarctica went extinct as the continent settled over the South Pole, and it mostly went extinct in South America when South America got placental colonists from North America. With the exception of the highly adaptable and generalized opossums, one species of which even managed to spread into North America. This generates a prediction that we should see early Cenozoic marsupial fossils in Antarctica, and what do you know, but that's what we have found. Creationism has shrugs, and ignoring the problem of biogeography.
And the most extreme of these are things like marsupial mole, which actually burrows under the ground.
Obviously, otherwise it wouldn't be called a mole, but moles have actually evolved a bunch of times. We have true moles, we have rodent moles like the mole rats, we have afrothere moles like the golden mole, we have marsupial moles, and we have pink fairy armadillos. Each of them is native to different regions where they did not face competition from other mole-like animals. And so because tunneling only has so many solutions, all of them have robust limbs with large flat claws for digging. All of them have small or absent eyes, since universally tunnels are dark and eyes are prone to injury. And there are even more similarities. But that's enough for now. Evolution predicts that this should occur, and it does. I'm not sure how that's a failed prediction. One of the big predictions of evolution is that if a niche or way of life for an organism is not filled in an environment, some organism will evolve to fill it. And to the degree that the same or substantially similar niches exist in different environments, separated from each other by some impassable barrier, different organisms will evolve to fill those niches, and they will become superficially similar to deal with similar challenges in their environment. That's the inevitable outcome of adaptive radiations and natural selection.
There's a placental mole which burrows under the ground. Look at them, they're almost identical in their appearance.
Superficially, yes, but dissect one. You'll find a pouch on the marsupial. You'll find a chambered uterus on the marsupial, and a single chamber on the true mole. You'll find an epipubic bone on the marsupial and not the placental. You'll find different digit numbers, with true moles having the basal mammalian condition of 5 digits, and marsupial moles only having 2 on the front limbs, etc. Just as is typical with convergence, and as is predicted with evolution, the similarities between distantly related organisms filling the same niche will be superficial, but underlying major structural differences will remain, and will be typical of the groups from which these convergent organisms evolved. I really do not know how he plans to spin a confirmed prediction into a failed prediction. I guess it's just by telling lies about either anatomy or evolution, or more likely, both.
Except the one has a pouch.
A pouch is far from the only difference, although it's probably the only difference that you can see, apart from digit count, without cutting open the animal.
You also have a flying phalanger, lots of flying.
The flying phalangers are a genus of marsupials that includes the sugar glider that is a popular pet in some parts of the world, and they are similar to flying squirrels and colugos in that they are animals that glide with membranes of skin that stretch from their ankles to their wrists. They also conveniently answer the question, what good is half a wing, that creationists like to ask. It turns out it's pretty darn good if all you need to do is to be able to glide.
Possum type thing, it glides rather than flies, and you have a flying squirrel, and almost identical appearance.
Except that again, you look at the internal anatomy and it's just as different as you would expect between a marsupial and a placental mammal. He's going to go on about the marsupial mouse next, and I'm skipping it. You get it at this point. You get my point. I'm not going to further waste your time with these interminable examples.
And so on. So these creatures have so many similarities, uncanny similarities, and yet they can't have a common ancestor that explains those because, see, you've got to trace marsupials. All the marsupials came from a common ancestor back here. So in other words, a marsupial mouse, a placental mouse, and the flying phalangia, and all these different marsupials arose from a common ancestor back here, which was the first marsupial.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting for him to say why any of this is a problem, especially since it's a prediction of evolution that this should happen.
And of course, the placental animals all had a common ancestor back here, which was the sort of first placental mammal.
Okay, yeah.
That's true.
So then they had a common ancestor way back here, which is some sort of reptile or something.
No, the common ancestor of marsupials and placentals was not a reptile. There are none, zero, sifr, par, reptiles in the ancestry of any mammal. The common ancestor of marsupials and placentals was a mammal, and it was the first therian mammal. And the common ancestor of therians and monotremes was also a mammal, and it was the first mammal. The common ancestor of mammals and reptiles was neither a mammal nor a reptile, but it was the first amniote.
Yeah.
But you don't have any explanation for the similarities between the marsupial mouse and the placental mouse.
Yeah, no explanation, except for, natural selection, basically the foundational concept behind evolution. The thing that was in the title to Darwin's book, quote, On the Origin of Species, by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, end quote. Natural selection isn't in the book title for a goof. And the thing is, this isn't an Institute for Creation Research video. They're the ones who are basically the only creationists who reject natural selection. So it's hard to figure out how Don is giving this argument in good faith.
Yeah.
It's just a fluke.
Natural selection isn't a fluke. It's the mathematically inevitable outcome of a reproducing population with mutation and heritability. And when I say mathematically inevitable, I mean there's a theorem. It's literally proven mathematically. Unless we're completely wrong about how genetics works on every level, then natural selection is real. Not even creationists are arguing that we're wrong about everything in genetics, and that's why creationists don't normally argue against natural selection. But for some reason, Don has decided to just ignore it in this case.
They look so similar, but they're not from the common ancestor.
That's right.
No, they are descendants from a common ancestor. The key is that that ancestor did not have these similarities. They evolved separately. There's no excuse for this sloppiness. I can excuse it in James, as he clearly has no idea what's going on, but Don has no such excuse. He has a PhD in a biological field from a real university. He knows better.
So in other words, evolution cannot explain them.
So what actually is the failed prediction here then?
There isn't one, because this is a confirmed prediction.
Stephen Jay Gould's...
For f***'s sake. I'm so tired of creationists lying about Stephen Jay Gould. They started doing it before his death, and they never stopped.
Was a very well-known American paleontologist and biologist and evolutionist. And he was at Chicago Field Museum of Natural History, a very highly published guy. And he pointed out that because evolution is based on random mutations, there's no way in the world that evolution could produce, in a different experiment, could produce the same creature.
And he was right about that. And you know how we know? Because it didn't. Convergence doesn't result in the same creature from different ancestors. Even Don knows this since he told us that the marsupial mole has a pouch, unlike a true mole. Has he forgotten his own words? Or is he so deep into dishonesty that he doesn't even care that he's contradicting himself from just a few minutes earlier? I don't know. You tell me what you think in the comments.
Yes, yeah.
In other words, if you ran the evolution experiment again, you wouldn't get what we have today. That's what he's saying.
You'd get something completely different.
Something really
random chance.
Yes, but you'd still get trees, ground cover, herbivores, omnivores, climbers, gliders, flyers, swimmers, carnivores, megafauna, etc. Because those are niches, not lineages. If those niches are open, something will evolve to fill them. And they will have the similarities to the organisms of current real Earth that are required to fill that niche. Whatever evolved to fill the tree niche will be photosynthetic. It will need structures that maximize surface area to catch light, which will look like leaves. It will need to be tall, so it will evolve weight-saving mechanisms and structural chemicals that will make it have tissue similar to those of our trees. Aquatic pursuit creatures will still be torpedo-shaped. Animals that live underground eating small animals and plant roots will still be sort of cylinder-shaped, with small eyes and big old claws for digging. But they won't be deciduous trees, sharks, dolphins, or moles. There'll be other things that we don't have names for. But fundamentally, all organisms have to deal with the laws of physics, and so all of them will have to solve problems that are presented by physics. And there are only so many ways to solve such problems, which means that natural selection will stumble upon the same solutions in various lineages, even though if you look under the hood, the lineages will remain quite distinct.
So here's a prediction.
No, here's Don's dishonest straw man.
An evolutionary prediction is that evolution would not produce two creatures which are almost identical.
Yeah.
Well, in superficial terms, it predicts the contrary, but in terms of underlying genetics and anatomy, it does predict that. And that's exactly the pattern that we see.
That would make sense.
Because it's based on random mutations.
Well, we're 5 out of 5 for so-called predictions that are actually straw men. Creationists are just incapable of describing evolution accurately, because once you know what it actually is, there aren't any arguments against it that are even remotely plausible. Evolution is in the small category of things where understanding and acceptance are almost the same thing.
But we find all these creatures which are so many similarities.
Yes, but only the similarities demanded by their lifestyle. We don't see similarities in other areas. Marsupial moles didn't evolve placental reproduction. Bats didn't evolve feathers. Dolphins didn't evolve gills, etc. We see a pattern of both difference and similarity, and it's the pattern predicted by evolution.
In fact, there's whole books been written about this, about the problem it is for evolution and trying to explain it.
And of course there are no such books, which is why he won't name them. What there are books explaining convergent evolution because, like everything else in science, you're unlikely to understand it without learning about it, and books are a way to impart learning to new people.
And in fact, they have a technical term called homoplasy.
Homoplasy.
Which is similarities which are not due to evolution.
Jesus Christ, can this guy get anything right? Homoplasy isn't a similarity not due to evolution. It's similarity not due to common ancestry between the taxa with the similarity. The similarities are still things that evolved. They just evolved separately in different taxa.
Wow.
And they even try to claim these differences as something to do with evolution by calling it convergent evolution.
Yeah, because it demonstrably is the case that this has to do with evolution. And even creationists don't really have a way to dismiss this. Let's take two very different families, Canidae and Elephantidae. Both families are thought to share a common ancestor by both scientists and creationists, meaning that for creationists, at least two individuals came off the ark, then diverged into the current species. Now that's separately as different families for creationists, although actual scientists know that they also share a common ancestor between the families. Now two species, one from each family, have to deal with a similar problem, excessive heat. Loxodonta africana, the African bush elephant, and Vulpes zerda, the fennec fox, have evolved large ears full of blood vessels, which help cool both animals down. Now, neither scientists nor creationists think that the common ancestor of either animal had such gigantic ears, yet natural selection resulted in the same adaptation in each. This is convergent evolution, and the only way around it is to propose species-level special creation, something creationists are loath to do for several reasons. Chief among them being that we can see new species evolve in historical times, and that species-level creation would mean that the organisms that needed to be on the ark couldn't have all fit. Convergent evolution isn't just a prediction of evolution, it's actually a prediction of creationism too.
But convergence is a problem for evolution, a huge problem.
Weird how none of the evolutionary biologists seem to have noticed this huge problem. In fact, I don't even think I've seen creationists notice it before. Since, their so-called models also predict it. And notice how at no point has he actually explained how creationism deals with this. That's because creationism can't deal with this. This is tied into biogeography, a topic that creationists famously treat as anathema because nothing about all animal families, or at least all terrestrial tetrapod families, spreading out from a mountain in Southwest Asia can explain anything in biogeography. In fact, Australia is a particularly impossible to explain place given the Noah's Ark story as interpreted by your typical creationist.
And so we know that natural selection is a thing. Do you think that environments could have played a part in animals looking similar, or is that just too far-fetched?
Jimmy has figured it out. Jimmy, the guy who has no education in any of this, has figured it out. All it takes to figure this out is just knowing what natural selection is. That's it.
Well, that's the argument. The argument is, oh, well, they evolved to look the same because they evolved in the same environment or similar environment.
Yeah, it is, and it's pretty damn obvious that that's something that will inevitably happen. Also, it's not just that the environments are the same, it's that the niches are substantially similar. I get the sinking feeling that he's going to go on to not explain that particular nuance in his attempt to argue against this. But hey, I've been wrong before, so let's see what he does with this.
But the similarities are so profound that doesn't really wash.
What does that mean? How are we measuring profundity? How many profundity units do you need before natural selection can no longer account for a superficially similar morphology? Creationists once again just making up and not defining a term that they will then pretend presents a problem for science. It's just kinds and information all over again.
And I mean, you look at a kangaroo, for example, and it walks quite differently to a cow or a sheep.
Yeah.
Its mode of operation, mode of movement is very, very different. I think God actually created kangaroos just to sort of thwart that idea that, given the same environment, you get the same animal,
Which wasn't ever the idea, but kangaroos have converged with other low browsers like cervids and bovids in being fast-moving animals that tend to be social. What Don is basically saying is that because it doesn't look like a deer or antelope, that defeats convergence. But the primary way that those animals look superficially different is their mode of locomotion. But deer and antelopes aren't quadrupeds because quadrupedalism is an adaptation to low browsing and evading predation. They're quadrupeds because that's the basal state for artiodactyls, and it isn't a disadvantage. Similarly, those kangaroos that share that niche aren't bipeds because that's necessary to be a low browser, but because that's the ancestral trait for kangaroos, many of which have converged with other placental mammals in other niches, like tree kangaroos that have converged with primates in some ways.
In fact, we have animals in the same environment that look vastly different, that have different functions.
Well, yeah, if they have different functions in an environment, then that means that they have different niches, and we wouldn't expect a high degree of convergence.
I mean, even in Australia, we have some pretty crazy looking animals, and they've all had the same environment. So that would kind of disprove that they would have to look the same to survive in the same environment.
Maybe that would disprove that, if that were ever the prediction. What will converge and to what degree it will converge is always contingent on the actual selection pressures. For example, there is a high degree of molecular convergence between bats and toothed whales in the protein prestin. Both of these groups of animals use echolocation, and prestin is an important protein for that method of sensing the environment. As a result, they independently and convergently evolved the exact same protein, although the genetics for the protein in bats and whales are about as different as it could be while resulting in the same protein. But do bats and whales look the same? No, not at all. It's hard to think of two groups of mammals that look more dissimilar. On the other hand, whales have converged with sharks in overall body shape. But at the level of biochemistry, whales are no more similar to sharks than humans are. You can't simply look at two organisms, eyeball their level of similarity, and then declare that they are the same or not, or simply use that technique to decide whether they've converged or not, or to what degree. This is science, where eyeballing it is never more than the first step.
Okay. Well, we've talked about how we've had some common ancestors that aren't actually common, but some common-looking traits with animals.
What was that even supposed to mean? They should probably get a host who knows how to actually form sentences about evolution coherently. Although I suppose that those are pretty rare among creationists, a group that makes it their business to not understand science at even the most basic level.
Is there anything that's on like a molecular level that is similar?
I wonder if he'll mention bats and whales like I just did.
Yeah, there's some really good ones. Well, probably the most extreme one is where sonar in bats and dolphins.
Let's see how he screws it up.
Yes.
Everybody would know about that. So the insectivorous bats, for example, have sonar, and they're quite amazing at picking up insects and things on the wing. And
That's true.
And then dolphins have sonar. When they start looking at the molecular basis of the sonar, in other words, the genes involved.
Already he's screwing it up. The similarity is only strong at the level of amino acid sequence. The similarity is minimal at the genetic level. Who's surprised that he's already spreading lies about this very topic?
They found about 200 genes which are similar between bats and dolphins.
And they don't look similar at all.
First, I have never heard this claim, nor have I seen it in the literature. And of course, as we've come to expect from Don, we're not going to get a citation. So if I want to look this up, I have to sift through thousands of papers from all over the world spanning decades. Only to maybe find his source for this. Because for all I know, he doesn't have a source for this. In fact, I find it quite likely that he doesn't have a source for this.
Well, they can't have a common ancestor that explains that.
No, wow. And so what does that actually mean then for that being a failed prediction? Do you reckon that's a nail in the coffin that's just...
No, if echolocation, or as Don incorrectly put it, sonar, evolves in two different groups of animals, and only certain proteins facilitate it, then they will both evolve those proteins with a high degree of likelihood. And yet, because virtually everything else about their niches and habitats are completely different, they will remain morphologically very different. This is just how evolution works. Pointing to a thing that works exactly how evolution expects them to is never going to be a good argument against evolution.
That's true.
It's extreme, and it's an extreme problem for the storytelling.
No, it's an extreme adaptive pressure with only a small number of ways to relieve that pressure. So we should expect a high degree of convergence where that same pressure acts on multiple lineages. In fact, it is so in line with evolution that before I knew Don was going to bring it up, I myself brought it up as evidence for evolution.
Which says that mutations and natural selection over millions of years could produce extreme similarities at the molecular level, in the gene level.
Nope, we don't have extreme similarity at the genomic level, only the proteomic level, because fundamentally evolution can only see the phenotype. It can't see the genotype, which is why we only have genomic convergence to the point that it allows for phenomic convergence. And now I really want to explain what a phenotype is. So the genotype is literally just what's in the genome and how that genome is arranged. The phenotype is the actual anatomy, behavior, and biochemicals that an organism is made of. So two organisms with different genotypes can have identical phenotypes, at least in principle. For example, suppose you had an identical twin, but one of you has a mutation in one of your genes that results in a protein with exactly the same sequence. That genotypic change will cause no phenotypic change, and so you will both remain phenotypically identical to the normal degree that identical twins are identical. Conversely, since life history can change phenotypes, you and your identical twin could have different phenotypes with the exact same genotype. For example, perhaps you were not raised together and unfortunately your twin suffered from malnourishment that stunted his or her growth. Now you differ significantly in height, despite having the same genotype. Protein sequence is a part of the phenotype, and the convergence between toothed whales and bats is extremely high at that level, but the genomic similarity is only just high enough to allow for this convergence at the level of protein sequence. This is exactly what we would expect from evolution. But if the principle of common design, common designer held true, we would actually expect nearly identical genetic sequences, which we don't have.
With 200 genes similar, it stretches credulity enormously.
Science isn't in the business of caring about credulity. It's in the business of data, falsification, and predictions.
Yeah, and is there any other failed predictions of biological evolution that come off the top of your head?
I love when creationists ask for more evidence of creation when they've spent nearly an hour not getting any in the first place, except that they're too blinkered to realize it. Like with James here. On the one hand, it's sad that anyone is that brainwashed, but on the other, it's hilarious that they act so stupid for no good reason. Or rather, for bad reasons. Oh well, maybe we're about to see the sixth straw man, which would explain why there's still so much video left.
The expectation is that life is simple because otherwise it couldn't be explained by evolution, and we find that life is not simple at all.
Nope. The process of genetic drift increases complexity all on its own, regardless of selection pressures, and so we would actually expect for life to be overly complex, if anything. Simple life probably emerged as such out of whatever process first brought it about, but from that point on, genetic drift has been increasing that complexity. In fact, if you want an excellent video going over this by an actual population geneticist, then I suggest the video, The Evolution of Genomic Complexity, on the channel Zach B. Hancock. Dr. Hancock is a friend and occasional guest here on the channel, and this is literally his field of expertise. I'm sure I'll go deeper into how this works as Don spreads more information.
It's incredibly complex. And previously we've done with things like the junk DNA idea. You know, it's a huge failure for the evolutionary thinking.
Nope, it's not. It remains the case that in organisms like humans, some 80% minimum of the DNA is in fact non-functional or junk DNA. The closest this has ever come to being overturned was the 2012 paper by the ENCODE team that had a definition so bad for function that they changed it just 2 years later and put out a revised estimate for function that was in line with conventional predictions, which is where it stands today. Further, knockout tests where whole chunks of the genome are removed have resulted in healthy organisms who go on to reproduce just fine after having these chunks removed, meaning that if those bits of DNA were doing anything, it clearly wasn't very important. Also, I don't think that strictly speaking junk DNA is the same thing as complexity, but hey, I guess Don wanted an opportunity to spread even more lies before the interview was done.
To believe that we're full of junk DNA.
Yes, because we demonstrably are.
Yeah, which we've soon found actually has purposes that we didn't quite understand before.
Largely no, and we can tell in most cases quite easily. Very few of any functions for DNA in living things are completely sequence independent. That means for essentially all functions, DNA has to have an actual particular sequence of the nucleotides in order to perform that function. Now, all functions have some number of sequences that will still function either as well, better, or a bit worse. So, the sequence isn't normally constrained to one single sequence, but it's not free to completely vary. That means that functional DNA is affected by natural selection, which necessarily means that it will accumulate mutations more slowly than non-sequence constrained regions, because a large portion of mutations will be selected against. We can measure the variability in a section of a genome in a population to see whether and to what degree it is under selective pressure. If the level of variability is high, then it's not under selective pressure. If it is low, then it is, and the lower the variability, the higher the selective pressure. The vast majority of the genome is under no selection pressure whatsoever. Creationists have yet to even propose what functions such sections could even be doing that are sequence unconstrained. Instead, their proposed functions are all sequence dependent. The thing about this particular lie is that it requires a fair bit of background knowledge of genetics to really assess, which is why I think they use it. It's easy to spread lies about things most people don't know how to figure out in the first place. That's one of the reasons I think that creationism as a whole is more successful than, say, Flat Earth. All you really need to know to refute Flat Earth is how geometry works in the broadest sense. But for things like this, you need some specialized knowledge that most people will never bother to learn, because it's not important to their lives, nor is it interesting to them. Unfortunately, that leaves them open to grifters like CMI.
Well, we still don't understand much of the purpose in that. There's a long way to go.
No, we understand it quite well, and creationists have all the way to go. But after this, they run a commercial. As per usual, I don't let creationists advertise their scams on my channel, so we'll cut back in after the commercial.
So if you've been following along, we've actually had our 5 failed predictions already, but we actually miscounted. Those carbon-14 ones were meant to be paired together. We actually have a bonus number 6 for you right now. We're going to be talking about the idea of sexual selection. What actually is that?
Wait, I thought complexity and junk DNA was the bonus one. I guess we're moving on from that. Sure, why not?
So this goes way back to Darwin, and he was bothered by the fact that birds, male birds, are ostentatious. They have bright feathers and things, and particularly the peacock, which he said made him feel sick, trying to explain it from an evolution point of view.
He did say that in a personal letter sent before he wrote The Descent of Man, wherein he laid out the framework for sexual selection. This explained the peacock to his satisfaction.
He wrote that in a letter in 1860. In Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, he proposed that the peacock has this amazing tail.
This is the second time so far that this has happened in this video. It's a bit weird. It's like Don knows everything he needs to refute his own bullshit. This makes it much harder for me to assume that he's not lying.
Because the females like males with amazing tails.
Okay.
So he called it sexual selection. So the prediction is that the amazing features of male birds, particularly, and other creatures, are due to sexual selection. In other words, the females like the ones with the showy features, and that's why they have them.
Yep.
Right, and that sort of makes sense in my head. But you say it's a failed prediction. What's going on here then?
Well, people believed this for a long time, but not long ago, some Japanese scientists
Put in the comments if you think we'll get any more specificity that could allow us to find this study. I don't think we will, but I've been surprised before.
Set out to prove it. In other words, they set out to prove that the females liked the showy males. So they rated the tails of these wild population, and they rated them for their size and the number of eye spots and things like that. And then they monitored the matings, and there were 268 matings over 7 years that they monitored.
Oh, right. So plenty of data here.
Plenty of data, plenty of observations, and they found zero relationship between how showy the tails were and how successful they were at mating.
Wow. Cool. Another study done by anonymous people published who knows where. Well, let's look at some recent papers that have shown support for sexual selection in peacocks. We've got Evolution by Natural Selection by Marion Petrie, published in Frontiers of Ecology and Evolution on December 15th, 2021, and Genomic Insights into the Molecular Basis of Sexual Selection by Shubham et al., also published in Frontiers of Ecology and Evolution on January 27th, 2021. In the paper Condition-Dependent Mating Assessment and Choice by Peahens, Implications for Sexual Selection, published in Behavioral Ecology on May 28, 2014, authors Rosalind Dakin and Robert Montgomery found strong support for preference for increased iridescence in peacock trains among wild peahens studied, directly contradicting Don's claim that has no source. And that's where I'm going to stop, although there are literally thousands of papers supporting sexual selection in not just peafowl, but other birds, insects, teleos fish, etc. So I'll pit my 3 named papers and the thousands of other papers you can find on Google Scholar against Don's hypothetical paper that may or may not exist. I think I'm in the lead on that one. That last paper also interestingly showed that females approached males during the mating season more frequently and stayed for longer when they themselves were healthy.
So the idea is that the ones with the showy tails would have more matings and pass on their genes to the offspring, and that's what brought about the showy tails to start with.
A conclusion supported by numerous papers.
Right, so if the showy tails are not for mating,
which they are, and even if you don't know about sexual selection, you might notice that peacocks use them in their courtship dances, so it's hard to see how anyone could believe they're for anything else.
Having a showy tail doesn't seem like a particularly practical, or I guess like if you were evolving to an environment, you wouldn't want to have something that's slowing you down and making you a huge target to some kind of predator, right?
Right, which is why they would be eliminated by natural selection unless there is some other pressure keeping them around. I can't imagine what Don is going to suggest is the selective pressure for a peacock train if it's not sexual selection.
Well, I mean, you'd be more obvious to the predator for a start.
Your giant tail is not
and this massive
practical.
tail means you can't duck between the trees and into the bushes and get away from predators. That's right.
So what is the advantage here of having this tail?
Well, good question.
Yeah, it is. And he could have answered that when it was first asked.
And you would think that since it doesn't help with their mating,
which again, it demonstrably does, and Don apparently just making up some Japanese scientists who disagree doesn't change that. Of course, if he bothered to cite the team, then we could look it up. But given that professional young Earth creationists are, in my experience, universally dishonest, I'm going to assume that no such paper exists until shown otherwise. And of course, if there is a real paper he's citing, the chances of it being a Trojan source are extremely high.
Yeah.
And under normal situations, you'd expect predators and things to be after them.
Yeah.
And it would hamper their ability to escape.
I needed a new heel for my shoe. So I decided to go to Morganville, which is
you
what
would think
they call
that the sexual
Shelbyville.
selection must be very strong for it to overcome the negative side of having such a tail. But obviously, the Japanese scientists could find no relationship.
Yeah, the Japanese scientists who don't seem to exist.
It must be a strong relationship to overcome the negative side.
Yes.
I mean, the effort you put into making the tail to start with.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it. Get on with it.
It's like a large portion of their body. If the peahens didn't prefer sexually to have big tail that's bright and colorful, can you explain like the intricate design of the tail then? Why does it look that way?
This is now Jimmy's third time asking this question. Maybe third time's the charm and Don will actually answer instead of repeating reasons why this idea is so goddamn stupid.
Well, the design of the tail is sort of sidestepped by this whole thing because the Darwin's thing, oh, well, it explains the tail, but how does it explain the origin of the genes?
So no, he's not going to answer the question. He's going to answer an entirely different question of where did genes come from? I'm going to lose it again. Don Batten might be the most annoying creationist I have ever covered. If the point he wanted to make was that he thinks that sexual selection isn't real, but he has no alternative, he could just say that. Obviously, it would be rhetorically weak, but at least it wouldn't have involved wasting everybody's time by having James ask him the same question 3 times. And let's be clear, it's a damn good question. If you're going to throw out sexual selection on the basis of made-up Japanese scientists, you sure as shit better have some explanation that you can use to explain the phenomenon. Because in the absence of one, even if the Japanese team were real, what you'd have is a mechanism that has been supported in thousands of papers, makes predictions that have been and continue to be confirmed, and one paper that says, maybe not. That's nothing. That's not even enough to question sexual selection as a mechanism. That's one fluke paper. And again, that's assuming there even is a paper, which I have no reason to believe is true. On the other hand, if he wanted to have his point be that he doesn't understand how new genes arise, and therefore they can't, he could have made that point at the outset. Sure, the whole thing is just an argument from ignorance, but at least then, we wouldn't have had our time wasted. Jeez, this guy is infuriating. How does anyone watch this man and not want to just punch him in the throat when he does stuff like this? Not that anyone should, that's battery and bad, but holy crap is it tempting when he pulls nonsense like this.
Which actually specify how to make such an elaborate tail. With all the eye spots and...
They're the same genes as in other birds. They're just developmental genes and protein coding genes for things like integument broadly, placoid development, keratin, and melanin. No new genes are needed to make a peacock train that aren't already in related species like chickens, partridges, or grouse. And you might notice that those related species also have various degrees of fancy display feathers, although peacocks take it to an extreme.
Yeah, the colour in the tail is actually not due to pigments, like red and yellow pigments and things like that, or green, but it's due to refraction. So the little scales on the feathers actually aligned.
Feathers don't have scales, but he's right that it's based on refraction and not pigmentation. This is why the feathers are iridescent. That is, their color and reflectivity are determined at the macroscopic scale by the angle of incidence between the surface of the feather and the light hitting and reflecting off of it. This cannot be done with simple pigments. It's a matter of physical structures on a microscopic scale. But guess what controls that? Keratin genes. The same genes that are in basically all tetrapods, even you. Now, it's not the same version of the gene, but it's still a keratin gene. So where do the genes for this come from? Previous keratin genes.
In a precise way to actually reflect the light. So the only colour in the peacock's tail is melanin, which is a brown colour.
Wrong again, or rather half wrong. Eumelanin is a dark brown, but pheomelanin, the other kind of melanin that birds have, is a rusty orange color. And it's the color you see on the breasts of both European and American robins. Which, by the way, are not closely related. Pheomelanin is also the main type of melanin in freckles, red hair, and blonde hair in humans. So our host James makes a lot of pheomelanin.
Brown colour pigment, and yet it's all those amazing colours. They're due to refraction, reflection of light with these little scales and things. So there must be quite an intricate design written into the DNA to how to make this. So that's the first thing.
That doesn't at all answer the question of why the peacock has its train and how it persists. You know, that question that Jimmy asked 3 separate times and that Don isn't even trying to answer? And yes, I know he talked a bunch about design without any way of showing any evidence of design in the peacock train. And yeah, this acknowledgement is as much as I want to address that. Unless he actually makes an argument for design, him just mentioning it isn't really worth my time to refute at length.
If the females did prefer a showy tail, no, they don't.
Yes, they do.
How would that explain the origin of it?
Yeah.
It doesn't.
They wouldn't. It's mutations that explain the origin of these features, and it's female mate choice sexual selection that explains the persistence of those mutations that make the train so fancy. It's not really that hard to understand. In fact, it's so easy to understand that I'm pretty sure that Don is being intentionally obtuse in an attempt to deceive his audience.
And the flip side of that is the females would need genes which said You prefer a male with a showy tail.
Yeah, okay.
Which again is mutations. And at first, they probably will be neutral and therefore just fixed because of genetic drift, since at first, none of the males are likely to have particularly showy tails. But once some subset of males have even slightly more showy tails and thereby get even slightly more offspring than other male contemporaries, we're off to the races with sexual selection. Is that a bit of a coincidence? Of course it is. But that's also why we don't see sexual selection in every lineage. But in birds, showiness seems to be something that goes all the way back to the most recent common ancestor of birds, since it appears in all lineages of birds. And given what we know about other dinosaurs, it's plausible that sexual selection for showy males goes all the way back to the origins of Dinosauria.
So you need both these things to come together for sexual selection to work, and it doesn't explain the origin of the features.
Yeah, when you leave out the source of new genetic features in your explanation, you tend not to explain the origin of new genetic features. But that doesn't mean there isn't one, it just means that you're either ignorant or lying.
Yeah, so you've got a showy tail. Where'd this even come from to start with? And how the peahens would have actually had to have genetically thought that was cooler as well and, mate with them.
The instinct must be to want males with showy tails.
It doesn't actually have to start with tails specifically, and the tail isn't even the only thing that's showy on a peacock. They also have head crests and iridescent coloration all over much of their body, especially the throat. It just has to start with a preference for shiny or colorful things, something birds are kind of known for.
So if this is the case that, this is the peacocks don't actually benefit from really having a showy tail sexually, and it's not beneficial really for them in any kind of environment for survival, does this sort of make Darwin's theory of sexual selection a little bit dead in the water?
That's basically the fourth time James has asked about this. I really hope he gets an actual answer to this question and not another deflection. And of course, this version of the question is an obvious softball.
So this is another serious blow to the idea, the cosmic evolution idea, that everything made itself over billions of years and without any purpose or anything like that.
Yeah, okay. Well,
at least he answered a related question. Of course, we still have no idea how he explains the existence and persistence of a peacock's fancy tail, so this was just a waste of time.
I think a lot of people here, if they were watching it and they did believe that cosmic evolution was, in fact, the answer.
Despite the inane phrasing, I suspect he's talking about me and probably most of you watching this.
They would probably tell us that this is how science works, actually. We make a prediction, we observe what happens, and then we go back to our original prediction and change it. So what would you say to that?
First, what I would say is that yes, that is how science works, and in this case, we don't really need to change anything, because multiple studies have confirmed the prediction of female mate preference in peafowl, and only one seemingly made-up study that disagrees with it doesn't in any way provide evidence to the contrary.
Yes, somebody said that well, this is how science works. You have a failed prediction and you just modify your theory, so...
Yeah, and saying it with a mocking tone doesn't change that.
But these are not just minor tweakings. These are major failures.
What are the 6.5 things that we covered, most of which had nothing to do with evolution per se, none of which were actual real predictions from science, and about which we heard almost nothing but lies? No, they're not failures. They're lies from a pseudoscientist, or two if you count Snelling. Why would that be a problem for science? It's not. It's a problem for science communication, but that's not the same thing.
If what they say is true, it means that evolution is irrefutable scientifically. It's unfalsifiable.
No, it doesn't, because there's only so much you can modify a hypothesis or theory before you just can't support it anymore, or it becomes something so different that it's no longer recognizable as the same hypothesis or theory. And evolution makes testable predictions. It's just that they keep coming true, and they keep coming true so much that Don has to make shit up to even pretend that the predictions don't keep coming true.
And in fact, some people have actually admitted that it's not falsifiable. I think it is falsifiable, but some of the evolutionists themselves have actually said that.
Once again, no citation.
So Professor Charles Birch and Paul Ehrlich, in a Nature paper some years ago, said something which I'd like to actually get exactly right. So I read it out to make sure I'm not misquoting them.
Wow, I was wrong. Is this going to be our first citation here at the end, when all the alleged evidence has already been presented? Also, this means that he has a tablet handy on which he could have stored every single reference, meaning that he doesn't have the excuse of having forgotten his notes or anything like that. He was fully capable of citing every single alleged source he relied upon. He chose not to.
But this is Professor Charles Birch and Paul Ehrlich in Nature magazine, the world's top science journal, and quoting, "Our theory of evolution has become, as Popper described," he was a philosopher of science, "one which cannot be refuted by any possible observations. Every conceivable observation can be fitted into it. It is thus outside of empirical science, but not necessarily false. No one can think of ways in which to test it."
You know, the weird thing is that when I look for this on Google Scholar, the only place I can seem to find it quoted is from Creationist drivel going back to the 1970s. So I refined my search to look for papers between 1900 and 1980. This resulted in one return, a paper by P.R. Ehrlich and L.C. Birch, published in the American Naturalist in 1967 called Balance of Nature and Population Control. That quote doesn't appear anywhere in it. Searching the Nature archives themselves yielded only one result by those authors, Evolutionary History and Population Biology, published in Nature on the 22nd of April, 1967. It turns out that this is his source, an obscure ecology paper from the 1960s with only 23 citations. Do you know what follows that quote? A desire for more research so that evolutionary predictions in the context of ecology can actually be testable. This is a paper about the use of evolutionary theory in an ecological context. It's not about phylogenetics or evolution broadly. And do you know what has happened in the nearly 6 decades since this paper was published? Yeah, the research that was called for. Also, since Don doesn't actually agree with the sentiment of what he just quoted, what was the point of this? Neither he nor science broadly thinks that evolution isn't falsifiable, but it's falsifiable the way that the oxygen theory of fire or the germ theory of disease is. In principle, it could be falsified, but at this point, all three of these theories have so much overwhelming evidence that the chance of us ever actually falsifying any of them are negligible. Also, I hate that so far, the only source that has been cited still took me like 40 minutes to find it. What the hell is so hard about author or authors, publication title, paper title, publication date?
So this is where these people are coming from. Basically, evolution's a fact, we don't need to test it.
By these people, he means 2 scientists who wrote an obscure paper in the 1960s that hasn't even managed 24 citations, and that he couldn't even cite properly. And he means a section that was calling for more research that has been conducted in the intervening almost 60 years.
Yeah.
So no matter what you say, no matter what evidence you present, no matter what predictions fail, they'll stick to it.
That's a testable hypothesis. Now all we have to do is find some of those failed predictions and see what happens. Unfortunately, none of the 6.5 that we've been served up actually fit the bill. And in case you're wondering, I'm talking sexual selection as one of the 6, and the tangent about not knowing what mutation is as a half a prediction. So now you don't need to ask what the 6.5 were in the comments. And if you do, it means I get to tell you to watch the whole video.
Right. It's an unfalsifiable truth at this point in their minds.
Yeah.
Imagine complaining about unfalsifiability when your own explanation is literally just magic from an all-powerful guy.
So if they want to say that evolution is not science,
which they don't want to do because it very much is,
I'm happy to go there. I totally agree with him.
Except he doesn't, because he said he thinks it's falsifiable. I don't typically have the morons I talk about contradict themselves within such a short time frame. But Don Batten has done just that. I might have a new overall least favorite creationist. Although, to be fair, it's a stiff competition, and I am prone to immediacy bias. So I probably can't make that determination with any confidence just yet. He's certainly up there, though.
Which is effectively what they're saying by saying that no matter what failed predictions there are, evolution stands.
And by they, he doesn't mean the scientific community or even biologists broadly. He just means 2 ecologists from the 1960s in a paper that I might be the first to read in decades that has barely ever been cited. Of course, he wants you to think that that means the whole scientific community, but it doesn't.
And so you mentioned Charles Birch, the professor.
Yep, the Australian biologist and theologian who was the first Australian awarded the Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion. And no, I neither know nor care what that means.
I think we were chatting earlier, and you actually knew Charles Birch. How did you find him?
He was actually a professor at the University of Sydney when I was doing my studies there.
Well, I think that explains a few things.
And he's an interesting character. He used to have lunchtime lectures, and what student would go along to a voluntary lecture by one of your lecturers, at
Definitely
lunchtime?
Not me. Definitely not me.
I think Don might be dangerously close to sodomy right now, which I think his version of Christianity sees as a sin.
But he was an interesting character, and he presented very interesting lectures. And so I remember going along to one of these lectures at lunchtime, and place was full. The lecture theatre was full.
I really hope this gets to a point fast.
And he said something which really rocked me, really impacted me. He said, some of you students are worried about evolution. He said, don't worry too much about it. I don't know whether I believe it myself. And I said, what? What did he just say?
Believe it.
Yeah, it's not going anywhere. Don just goes on about how Birch saying that made Don think that maybe evolution is a religion. I don't particularly care about that. And after that, it's just James giving Don an opportunity to advertise his book, and since I'm still not going to let Creationists advertise in my videos, I'm skipping that. Bringing us to the end of the video, and the end of this series. Well, we got a lot of straw men, an almost complete lack of citation, a lot of lies, and even avoiding the question from a guy being interviewed by the friendliest and most on-site interviewer imaginable. Like usual, this was a very disappointing showing from the Creationists. One day, maybe, they'll have a good point about something in science. But that day does not seem to be today, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please hit like on this video and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. And remember, if you want to support what I do, please consider joining the channel memberships or the Patreon. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovand, Tapioca Weasel, Arrow Dodger, Dan Sheedy, Eleron Teller, Phil Rivara, Ian Chen, Joshua Geese, Kelvin Brostic Van Manen, Landed Knoll, Regios, Sphincter of Doom, The Plastic Mouse, Vollus, North Texas Fossils, and John Ackerman. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.